It happened one evening in a restaurant that served grilled chicken. On the table, as one would expect, stood a huge plate of chicken. A European-looking man named Hugo, a holy sign of Sagittarius, said that tomorrow Harry, the 13th awakened, was destined to die. Harry, who was sitting opposite, chewing chicken, asked discontentedly, "Do you really think so little of me?" The man's face was covered in scars, and he had one blind eye, and he had the hood of his jacket pulled over his head. Harry asked if it was because he had taken all the legs from the plate. A little angry, the man opposite replied that it was not like that at all. Continuing to chew his chicken, Harry said that he understood the reasons for his concerns, but he had nothing to worry about, and he was definitely not going to die. He chuckled and said that he had killed more misfortune bringers than all 12 constellations combined. So how could someone like him die? Hugo just clasped his hands together tensely and stared at the table. There is a demonic tower in this world. This tower is the home of a terrible monster that can bring death to all mankind. It all started on the last day of the 20th century, namely, when the mighty ones who bring misfortune have driven humanity into a corner with their overwhelming power. They left behind only pitch darkness and chaos, and it was during this period that 12 gods appeared, calling themselves sacred beings. They vowed to give humanity the power to fight off all monsters, and they chose 12 people to be granted that same indescribable power. But one day something happened that no one expected. The 13th awakened appeared, who was without the blessing of the sacred entity. Moreover, this awakened one was so powerful and so incredible, and therefore even the 12 saints were not his equal. And this awakened one was none other than Harry. Hugo and Harry reached the entrance to the demonic tower, where 12 saints were already waiting for them. Hugo thanked the man for the fact that it was thanks to him that they would be able to organize an attack on the demonic tower. Sitting down on a rock, Harry replied that words were not enough, and that he wanted a 5-year supply of fried chicken, to which the man asked him if he was not tired of it yet. And then he irritably noticed that the man continued to pronounce his last name incorrectly, to which Harry said that his last name sounded stupid. One of the saints, a girl with long blue hair, said with a smile that after defeating the red-eyed one, an incredible reward would await them, to which the man who was next to her chuckled and said that the reward would be at least $100 million, since this monster is considered the most terrible. Suddenly, Harry, covering his face with a scarf, told them that they would be better off asking for 10 years of accommodation in a 7-star hotel somewhere in Hawaii. And then he said that it would be better this way, because of the red-eyed one, many countries are on the brink of crisis. The man who had spoken earlier about the reward grinned nastily and called the boy. And then, with the same grin, he asked him if he shouldn't raise his standards if he wanted to work with them, and if he didn't want to heal his disfigured face and body. Looking at their backs, Harry thought that they were not saints at all, just a bunch of scum who only cared about their own gain. Suddenly, the two turned around and addressed the guy again. Laughing nastily, the man told the guy to stop rushing to help everyone he came across, because only a few victims would recoup that price. The guy sighed heavily and said that it was time for them to go, and he thought how good it was that he would never see them again after finishing this business. The saints entered the cave, long stalagmites hung from the ceiling, and everything around was illuminated by a warm glow. The saints stopped and looked up in amazement. They looked at something so big that they had to lift their heads. As it turned out, they were already in front of the Lord of the Demonic Tower, next to whom they all seemed like small flies. Harry thought that just one look at the Lord made him feel a terrible pressure. Suddenly the ruler opened his mouth from where something lit up, and his gaze did not leave the people who came to him. Everything around the cave shook violently, and the saints began to look around. The ground, unable to withstand the pressure, began to crack. The pressure was so strong that Harry put his hands out in front of him to protect himself as he began to be swept backwards. The stone in front of the ruler's throne cracked, and a bright light burst out from the cracks. And then a huge glowing pillar broke through the floor, rising upward. This pillar of light lifted up all the saints who were within its area of effect. A pillar of light burst from the roof of the castle, and everything around was illuminated. Soon this light faded, and everything around was filled with smoke. The frightened saints, who missed this pillar of light, hid against the walls of the castle. At their feet was a cliff, under which lay a whole lake of lava. The throne of the ruler remained untouched. Only the smoke from this blow hid it. The Lord raised his head smugly, looking around, a wide smile on his face. The saint girl had already recovered a little from this action, but her body continued to tremble slightly, and she could only quietly say that they needed to run. And then she screamed, and all 3 saints who were still alive immediately ran back. Harry remained standing where he was, turning to face them, and quietly said that he couldn't believe that these bags of shit were called saints. He gripped the handle of his weapon tighter, thinking that it didn't matter to him anyway. After all, he will be the one who kicks this red-eyed guy's ass. And then he, breaking the earth, instantly rushed forward. With a sharp movement, he jumped up and found himself right at the level of the monster's forehead. The guy swung his weapon to strike. After some time, Harry continued to strike. He didn't know how much time had passed, but he didn't stop killing monsters. His eyes glowed with a terrifying blue light, and in his teeth there was a dagger. Only one thought was in his head: I must cut up monsters. In the shadow of the cave, many red eyes appeared, different in shape and size. A huge number of monsters appeared in front of Harry, who no longer had his jacket on, and he thought that this was a special trap in which more and more hordes of monsters were constantly appearing. Harry no longer had his left arm. His body was covered in scars, but his eyes continued to sparkle with a cold blue light. Clenching his jaw even harder, causing his gums to bleed, he wondered if they all thought he would give in so easily. There was a mad light in his eyes as he promised himself and all the saints that he would survive and tear them all to shreds. Time moved forward inexorably, and now 20 years have passed since that moment. Harry was approaching another monster, who exclaimed that this could not be. He asked the man how he got there, to which Harry replied that he was the last one left. The monster pressed himself even more tightly against the stone and screamed in panic, begging for help. Harry raised his foot to step on the monster, a long beard already growing on his face, and he said that it was already over. Then he crushed the monster's head with his foot, sending blood spraying into the air. Standing in front of the corpse of the last monster, Harry sighed heavily and tiredly. Looking up at the sky, he noted that it was finally over. But suddenly everything around began to shake, causing stones to fall from somewhere above. The man weakened and began to fall to the ground, weakly saying that he would finally be able to get out of here, and everything around him continued to shake. And then he fell to the ground and the stones covered his body. After some time, it was already daytime outside. The city's high-rise buildings had long since been destroyed, and the air was brown from dust and dirt. The boy running next to the older man said that he had said that this was not the best way, to which the man replied that he had not known that things would turn out this way, and that he had been told that today was safer than usual. And as it turned out, several high-ranking monsters were chasing them. The guy, with tears in his eyes, exclaimed that everything was bad. And yet the fortune teller told him that today, he would meet a monster with whom he should not associate himself. One of the monsters suddenly pushed off the ground and jumped. And then, he landed right between the boy and the man. The guy fell to the ground and in anger, he hit the ground with his fist. As it turned out, they were now surrounded by these monsters and therefore could do nothing. As he got to his feet, the boy thought that if only Master Harry could return from the demonic tower, those damn monsters wouldn't dare to be here. And suddenly the gates of the demonic tower swung open. The boy and the man stared at this in surprise. And then there was an explosion. Trying to protect themselves from the gusts of wind, the boy and the man put their hands in front of them. And, as it turned out, part of the land was simply destroyed, causing a circle to form on the earth. The boy and the man were buried under rubble, and the second asked what it was. Suddenly he called out to the boy, calling him Charlie, and said that someone was coming out of the destroyed tower. And indeed, someone came out of the tower, and his strong hand appeared, with veins bulging on it. A lonely figure stood in the midst of this ruined area. This someone clenched his hands, cracking his fingers, and sighed with relief. Dark lightning appeared from his body, and the man exclaimed that these bastards had struck him in the back and left him to rot in this hole. He suddenly thrust his hand forward and shouted that they were now in complete shit. He then delivered a blow to the jaw of one of the high-ranking monsters, and he pinned another one to the ground with his foot. The man, who was still under the rubble, said that he couldn't believe that someone was able to easily deal with orange-class monsters. The man continued to beat the monsters, and a whole mountain of them accumulated under his feet. Then he got distracted, and then he suddenly jumped up, causing a column of dust to rise into the air. And then with one foot he smashed the debris under which Charlie and the man were, and they recoiled in fear. Falling to the ground, Charlie asked the man why he decided to attack them, to which the man merely said that it looked like his work here was done, and the others breathed a sigh of relief. And then Charlie asked his friend if this wasn't a real sensation, because some person was able to get out of the tower, to which he replied that this couldn't be, and he just happened to be nearby. Suddenly, a shadow fell on the place where they were still sitting on the ground. As it turned out, it was a huge wolf, its eyes glowing red and drooling from its mouth. The men sitting on the ground screamed in fear that it was the leader of the pack. And then one of them shouted at the man that he advised him to run away from there. The monster's eyes glowed even brighter, and red lightning bolts erupted from its body. and then he opened his mouth from which a beam of red light burst forth. The men cowered in fear, pressing their hands to their heads. This beam of light illuminated the space in front of the monster, destroying everything around. The explosion was so powerful that it could be seen several kilometers away. Soon the light went out and everything became quiet. Charlie and his friend were surprised to notice that they were still alive. Opening their eyes, they noticed in front of them only the broad back of a strange stranger, who stood in a relaxed pose. Looking around, they noticed that the earth was destroyed by that beam, but they did not feel the impact because there was a man standing in front of them. Charlie's friend thought that perhaps this stranger had protected them. And then the stranger took off and jumped high into the sky, causing everyone else to look up. The man raised his hand to strike the huge dog. With one powerful blow, he smashed the beast's head into the ground. Charlie and his friend were quite surprised by this. The stranger landed on the ground with a grin on his face. And then he proudly turned to the men, while the corpse of the monster lay behind him. He said that he was definitely finished now, but he himself noted with displeasure that it stunk in there. And then his gaze moved somewhere to the side, and he quietly muttered something. He turned to the men standing behind him, causing them to flinch in fear. The man began to turn towards them to say something, his whole body radiating some kind of unkind green light. The men shook with fear, trying to understand what he wanted to tell them. But the stranger only smiled good-naturedly and asked them to buy him some food. He scratched his head awkwardly while the men just fell silent in shock. And then he added that clothes wouldn't hurt either. After some time, the stranger and the two men reached a small cafe. The man put the now empty plate on the table with a sharp movement. Charlie's friend glanced at the check and, noticing the cost of the meal, practically gave up the ghost. And then they indignantly asked the stranger how he managed to eat $1,000 worth of food, to which he replied, "But you said you didn't have much money, so I ordered just a little." He then turned around to order another helping, and noticed that they themselves had spoken of their willingness to pay for his dinner for saving their lives, at which Charlie's friend shouted indignantly. Charlie, covering his ears, asked the stranger who he was and why he was near the tower. The man, chewing on a toothpick, replied that he had been inside the tower and then simply walked out of it, to which surprised exclamations were immediately heard, and the man said that he had one more question. He asked them who they were because they looked like ordinary townspeople, but they emitted a magical aura. Charlie's friend replied that it was because the guy was a Templar, and then he asked him if he himself was a Templar. Picking up his spoon from the table, the stranger replied that he had no need to wag his tail in front of some big shot. But suddenly, something surprised him. He looked at his reflection in the spoon, and suddenly his face became distorted as if from fear, and cold sweat ran down his face. He slammed his hands on the table, stood up with a sharp movement, and exclaimed that he urgently needed a mirror, to which the waitress quietly pointed it out to him. Approaching the mirror, the man began to take off the clothes he had received. He stared at the mirror in shock, his hand almost touching his face. He noted that his body was completely healed. Harry thought that his old wounds were so terrible that there was no point in even trying to heal them. And then he came to his senses and noticed that his left hand was also in place. He looked at his palm, which now had some kind of round mark on it. When the man looked at it, the sign began to appear, and a snake became clearly visible on his palm. Suddenly, Harry felt a strong pain in his arm, which made him grab it tightly. The veins on his arms bulged. The guy's body began to emit green light, and the outline of a snake appeared behind his back. The man closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he was no longer in the cafe. His whole body seemed to have turned into a disembodied spirit. In front of him was a huge snake, which looked at him with its red eye. The man seemed tiny compared to the snake, and the snake released its thin tongue. Harry reached out to touch her. When he did this, a bright light shone from the place where they touched, and then everything around lit up with a bright yellow light. The next moment, Harry woke up sitting on the floor of the cafe, with his hand extended forward. Charlie extended his hand to help the man up and asked him if he was okay. Harry waved his hands and asked if they had seen a huge snake, to which they only stared at him. Charlie said they didn't see any snake. They just saw him suddenly take off his clothes and run to the mirror, and then start screaming while clutching his wrist. Looking at his palm again, the man concluded that it seemed like no one else could see it except him. And then the man felt something behind him. As it turned out, these were some tablets with text that said that he had survived death. And now he became the owner of the constellation Ophiuchus, as well as a description of his abilities. One of his skills was super regeneration, and Harry thought that he had never heard of other saints seeing anything like that before. Moreover, he does not feel the energy of sacred beings. However, be that as it may, he was satisfied with this arrangement because his body had fully recovered. Now he needed to track down the traitors who had left him for dead, and especially the one who had stabbed him in the back. Harry, thinking about this, tensed his hand, causing his veins to bulge, and he said that this whole body began to tremble just from the thought of revenge. And Charlie and his friend, noticing the strange behavior of the man, shook with fear. At the same time, somewhere in the place where the incident took place, police tapes were already hanging. The man standing nearby said that the demonic tower, which was considered an indestructible fortress, had suddenly collapsed, to which the other replied that this news would soon set the whole world on its ears. The first one said that this place has a special connection with Harry. Could this be the work of his followers or other saints? The second man replied that it was interesting, and then he told the other to look at the one who was pulling. He said that this was a monster that was difficult for even high-ranking saints to deal with. So who else could challenge such a monster and destroy the tower? Then the first man asked if Harry had really gotten out of the tower alive. Another told him that they couldn't be sure of that. They could only wait until new leads appeared. At the same time, something was happening in one of the city's multi-story buildings. There were many cameras in one of the rooms of this building. The reporters approached Victor and asked him how he could comment on the destruction of the demonic tower, and whether it was possible that Harry had returned alive. Victor, who was the holy sign of Aries, stood on the stage and did not answer. Taking the microphone, he said he had no comment on the matter, and then he and his bodyguards left the room, while reporters shouted after him, wanting answers. An expensive car was driving along the road at great speed. Victor, who was sitting in it, hit the armrest with force, breaking his glasses. He grimaced and exclaimed that he had heard Harry's name so many times today. He wondered if he had really been alive all this time in the demonic tower. All 20 years? Putting his hand into his vest, he thought that this couldn't be possible because there were thousands of deadly creatures there, and they were all black class. He took his pipe out of his pocket, thinking that it was a miracle that they had managed to escape from there, having stolen the red-eyed man's throat. And there was no way the man could have survived there. He bit his pipe and thought about how Harry's body was on edge due to the monster's deadly attacks. And he didn't even wear armor like all the other saints. He frowned, thinking that perhaps he really was still alive. Thinking about this, he exhaled a huge cloud of smoke, and then, clenching his jaws, he hissed that then it would be the end of them all. Meanwhile, Harry took Charlie's phone and said that he should start with this bastard. Meanwhile, a plane arrived at one of the airports, and only one person came out of it, who was greeted loudly. The bodyguards exclaimed that it was an honor for them to meet one of the 12 saints. As it turned out, the one who arrived on that plane was Hugo, the holy sign of Sagittarius. Descending to the ground, he asked the still bowing men where the Prime Minister was, and they replied that he was waiting in his office and that transport was ready. Hugo immediately headed towards the car, and the bodyguards bowed even lower. One of them, looking after the man, remarked with admiration how majestic he was. He said that this is exactly what a truly chosen person should look like. The car drove quickly along the road. Hugo sat silently on the seat, crossing his legs and looking out the window. Suddenly, his phone vibrated. Somewhat annoyed, he thought that it must be those annoying reporters again, and he couldn't believe that rumors about Harry's return had become so popular. He angrily turned the phone face down and exclaimed that 20 years had already passed, and his phone finally went silent. Frowning, the man stared out the window again. He remembered his words to him 20 years ago about Harry being destined to die tomorrow. As Harry replied, he had no idea that he had such a low opinion of him. Thinking about how when they attacked the demonic tower, at Harry's request, he went outside and held back the incoming hordes of monsters. He wanted to believe that his premonition was deceiving him, and that Harry would be able to get out alive. That day, after leaving the cave and meeting the other saints, the wounded Hugo asked them why Harry was not with them. And then it turned out that the saints who had entered Harry together had abandoned him and returned with the head of the red-eyed man. This event became known to the whole world. 20 saints, including himself, were recognized as heroes and gained even greater influence. Hugo, unable to believe that Harry was dead, asked again and again to begin searching for him. But Jean-Louis, the holy sign of the dark cancer, answered him with a grin that it was time for him to stop. He said that he knew perfectly well about the number of monsters in the demonic tower, so there was no chance that Harry survived. With an even more disgusting grin, the man said that if Hugo was so worried about Harry, then he could go looking for him alone. No one would stop him. But then the list of saints would be reduced to 11. Hugo didn't respond to this. He just clenched his jaws tightly, grinding his teeth in anger. Thinking about this, the man's mood worsened and he unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. Looking out the window, he thought that no matter how strong Harry was, he couldn't survive. And besides, too much time had passed. Suddenly, the driver announced that the Prime Minister was calling him. The man took the call, and the Prime Minister asked him if he could talk. to which he replied that he could and asked what was the matter. The Prime Minister asked him if he had heard the news yet, and then said that it seemed the demonic tower had been destroyed. Hugo clutched his head and sighed wearily, wondering if this story was happening again. And then he said that if the man wanted to ask him to start looking for Harry, then he had to refuse. Frowning, she said that the man died that day and that the incident with the tower was most likely a setup by his fans. And then he told the Prime Minister not to even hope to get more votes with this, to which he replied that this was not at all the case. He said that if the report that had just been transmitted to the South Korean government was true, then a call had been made to that number very recently. Not understanding what was going on, Hugo asked what kind of challenge this was. The Prime Minister replied that the call had been made to Harry's personal phone number, causing Hugo to shudder all over. He pounded his fists convulsively on the back of his chair and cried out, asking if it was true. And then, in a panic, he ordered the driver to stop the car. The wheels stopped abruptly, raising dust from the road. Reaching for the phone, Hugo thought that it might have been Harry calling him then. Looking at the screen, he saw that it said that he already had 39 missed calls and a voice message sent. The man stared at his phone screen with his mouth wide open. He tapped the phone screen to call the number that had called him recently. He sat tensely in his chair as the phone continued to ring. Suddenly, the call was answered and a voice came from the receiver, calling the man by the nickname Harry had called him. And then Harry told him in English that he would find him and kill him. And then he happily said goodbye to him. Hugo's mouth was wide open when he heard that voice. He realized that that manner of speech was so similar to Harry. Could he really be alive? And then he screamed, ordering the driver to return to the airport. Meanwhile, Harry was still sitting in the same cafe. He looked at the phone screen with a menacing grin and said that Hugo had grown up and now even dared to ignore his calls. Charlie asked him who he was calling so persistently, to which Harry simply replied that it didn't matter. And then he said that this smartphone, as the guy called it, is just an amazing thing. Harry said that he entered the tower in 2005, and now in 2025 the world has become a much better place, to which Charlie asked him if this was the first time he used a smartphone. And then he said that with it, he can connect to the internet and even follow the news. The man peeked out from behind his smartphone and asked if he could then watch the news about Harry. Charlie, pointing to his phone screen, replied that of course, since it was the hottest topic of discussion right now. And immediately a lot of different news and posts about Harry appeared on the phone screen. However, all the comments were negative, some were afraid of Harry, others didn't respect him and called him a loser. The man, reading this, got angry and squeezed the phone too hard, causing Charlie to scream in fear. Grinding his teeth, Harry exclaimed, asking who saved them from the red-eyed man. And yet these saints did nothing for them, and they praised them. He exhaled, calmed down and said that he should just ignore it, which was kind of sweet. Looking at his phone screen again, he saw the news about the revision of the will that Harry left. He decided to give all his fortune to orphanages and educational institutions in the event of his death. Remembering this, he smiled weakly and said that he hoped that all the money reached the recipients. And then he poked at the screen to see the news. But as it turned out, the news was about Harry leaving all his property, including relics, to the saints, in the hope that they would use them wisely for the benefit of the whole world. The man got angry again, but with even greater force, which made him squeeze the phone so hard that it shattered into small pieces, and he screamed that he would definitely strip them of their pathetic skins. Charlie fell to the floor next to the remains of his phone, a stingy tear running down his cheek as he said goodbye to the phone. Sitting back down at the table, Harry thought about what he should do. He thought about warning them about his return, but his appearance was very different from what it was 20 years ago. And even if he went out into the street and started shouting that he was that same Harry, no one would believe him. Therefore, he should torture each of the 12 saints separately, and he should go to the bottom for some time. Suddenly, he felt something approaching him from behind. A message appeared warning him that he was being watched, and Harry noted that he recognized the aura. He decided to leave the cafe, and noticing him, Charlie asked him where he was going, to which the man replied that he was going to get some fresh air. After leaving the room, he stopped on the street, and looking up at the sky, he was able to notice many spirits of some kind. As it turned out, these were avatars in the form of rams. Upon noticing them, Harry immediately realized that these were animals of the holy sign of the White Aries. There have been reports that these avatars have recreated the barrier in the name of the White Aries, and therefore the influence of other constellations has been neutralized and the avatars demand tribute. Clenching his fist, the irritated man said that even if they were sucking up to the sacred entities, who were they trying to command? However, then he heard someone calling his name, which made him turn around, still irritated. It turned out that it was some couple of people, and the man said that everyone was doing nothing but talking about this Harry, and the noise from this chatter would soon finish him off. The woman who was walking next to him, holding his hand, replied that she was talking about the same thing, and that this stupidity was being reported on all the news. The man, lighting a cigarette, said with a grin that, although the man's name was not tarnished, he was amazed that everyone had suddenly started showing interest in him. On the man's cardigan, a golden badge with the sign of the Gemini constellation glittered. Charlie, who followed Harry out, noticed this and realized that these people were from the twins constellation squad. Frowning, the man from the Gemini constellation squad noticed someone standing in his way. Charlie shouted at Harry to come back quickly and not to provoke these people. However, Harry didn't seem to hear him and continued to stand in place. The irritated man asked Harry what he was looking at and then ordered him to get out of there. Charlie and his friend, seeing this, became completely dejected and thought that they were finished. The man standing in front of Harry raised his hand to inhale more smoke from his cigarette, and then he exhaled all this smoke straight into the man's face, practically standing close to him. Noticing the displeasure on the man's face, the member of the Gemini constellation squad asked him if there were any problems, and then he leaned his forehead against him and defiantly told him to hit him if he had any problems. The woman who was with the man immediately told him to calm down, otherwise the boy was going to shit his pants. And then the couple started walking past, calling him a coward. They started to drift further and further apart, and the man said that all these idiots who were fanatics about Harry were no different from each other, and the woman supported him. And then she asked why this weakest saint was so popular with everyone, and whether the very act of canonizing him as a saint was absurd in itself. And these questions seemed to pierce the man's head. Charlie ran up to calm Harry down and told him that he had behaved well, and that it was good that he had not provoked the representatives of the Gemini constellation. However, the next second, Harry turned to the departing couple and shouted at them, calling them cockroaches. The couple turned around incredulously and asked again if he was talking to them. Completely furious, Harry replied that he was talking to them, and then he cracked his fists. The man from the Gemini constellation squad immediately turned around and walked back quickly. He stood face to face with Harry, pressing his forehead against his, and asked him irritably what he had just said. And then he started talking about how he was just a pathetic simpleton from whom there was not even a magical aura. But suddenly someone's hand rose above his head. Harry quickly flicked his finger to the man's forehead, sending him flying. He slammed into the wall of the house with a sharp movement, raising dust, and his woman screamed. Charlie and his friend froze in panic as they watched this. Harry stood there with a smug grin, his shirt blowing in the wind and his fingers still steaming. The woman decided that she could not stay away, and so she decided to use her ability, causing her body to turn into white light. A second later, she was behind Harry, but he immediately noticed her, asking her if she really thought he wouldn't notice her. And then with another click, he sent the woman flying, causing her to crash into the wall of another building. Touching his face with his hand, he quietly called these people losers. Charlie's friend exclaimed that using magic in the middle of the street was strictly prohibited, to which Harry replied that if he had used magic, there would have been no trace of those losers left. To which Charlie and the man were surprised to think that Harry had knocked out 2 A-rank Templars with just brute force. Harry suddenly noticed something and lowered his head a little, and then he crouched down to get closer to the man he had knocked out. He carefully picked up the medallion that hung around the man's neck, and then, with one sharp movement, he tore it off. And then he said that this is exactly what he felt when he hit the man, and he asked if it was a relic. Having looked at the medallion more closely, he asked where these people had obtained the relic, since only saints should have them. In response, Charlie asked the man if he really knew absolutely nothing, and then he said that several decades ago, humanity was practically wiped off the face of the earth. But thanks to sacred beings and the constellations they chose, people managed to survive this disaster. However, only 12 people could not protect this entire vast world, and so they decided that they had to start gathering followers, which today are called branches. Those who were given a piece of the power of the saints began to be called Templars. Such people began to be divided into ranks, according to their level of power. First saints, then cardinals, then bishops, and finally Templars. The main source of strength for the Templars is their faith, so there is strong competition and recruitment between branches. Thus, the chosen Templars receive relics from sacred entities from time to time. Hearing this, Harry thought that things had changed a lot in 20 years. But suddenly the guy pointed something out to him. As it turned out, the avatars that had previously just been hanging in the air were now all gathered around the man. There are reports that the avatars of wealth and greed, which are associated with the constellation of the White Aries, are enjoying this situation, They demand that the man quickly deal with the couple, and for this they promise a worthy reward. Charlie's friend, with his mouth wide open, told about Harry having attracted the attention of the avatars. These avatars were like reflections of the sacred beings themselves, and standing in their way was like challenging the gods themselves. The man exclaimed that they should hurry up and do as they asked, but Harry only laughed. He snapped his fists again and said that now he understood why he had felt that the stinking aura of Ares was so present, and that they were intending to fill their bellies, just like that pig. Putting his hands in his pockets, Harry took a step forward, saying that in the end, nothing had changed. He kicked the ground hard, causing the stone to crack, and everything around began to fill with Harry's turquoise aura. This aura began to attack the Ares avatars, causing them to make sounds of pain. A bright light illuminated everything around, causing Charlie and his friend to cover their eyes with their hands. And then the avatar barrier began to slowly disappear, and soon there was almost nothing left of it. And Harry said that they were showing off no matter what, even though they were worthless losers. Charlie looked around in surprise, not believing that the white Ares constellation had retreated. Looking at Harry again, he thought that this man was not an ordinary person. Harry called Charlie by name, and he immediately rushed to respond. And then he asked the guy again whether he had said that this couple belonged to the branching of twins. The guy replied that it was true, and in their country the twin branch had the greatest influence. It was an elite group that had gathered 2/3 of all major corporations. Then Harry asked if that meant they had a lot of money. He grinned menacingly and asked that then the clothes they wore must be expensive too. The man again went down to the other one and began to take off his clothes, saying that it was time for him to make some good money. After some time, all three reached some house. Pointing his finger at one of the windows, Charlie said that he lived on the second floor, and his friend said that his door was right next door. Charlie bowed to Harry and thanked him for saving their lives and even walking them home. However, there was no response, so the guy carefully opened one eye. Yawning, Harry asked them if they were going inside because he was already sleepy and he had clothes in his hands, while Charlie indignantly thought that this guy decided to spend the night with them. But the guy still let the man into the house, and he quickly took off his clothes, and strands of black hair flew onto the floor. Harry, now with his hair cut short, stood in front of the mirror, his hands on his hips, and then he looked at himself in the mirror and grinned. Charlie, seeing his new look, raised his finger up and said admiringly that the short haircut suits him very well. He exclaimed that the man looked even cooler now, causing Harry to become a little embarrassed and look away. He smirked as he thought about how in the past, due to the side effects of his abilities, he treasured every hair. Who knew that he would be fine with it now? But then he heard some sound and frowned. As it turned out, it was a mosquito, and the man asked what this attractant forgot in the apartment. With a sharp movement, he grabbed it and squeezed it tightly. When he released his hand, the remains of the attractant fell to the floor, and Charlie raised another finger up and said that even experts couldn't do this. And then he began to catch even more of the tempting ones. He asked why they were so attracted to him, to which the guy replied that perhaps they were attracted by his smell. But Harry, looking around, said that this usually happens when something is wrong with the house. His gaze caught on a shelf that was filled with all sorts of things, and he said that now it was clear why these creatures flocked here, and who would keep such abominations in the house anyway. Charlie said that all these things were received from the twin constellation personally. The guy said that these artifacts did not belong to him, but the saint blessed them. But suddenly something cut the statuette. The boy fell to the shards in panic, and Harry looked at his hand with disgust. Then he took the mask in his hands and said that this thing is intended for surveillance of the buyer. Continuing to rummage through the boxes, he threw out all the artifacts, along the way reporting what they do, and their effect was bad. The man asked whether these saints had not only appropriated his property, but had also started selling such disgusting goods. The man became very angry and said irritably that the very thought made him furious. He shouted loudly for the guy to throw it all away, and at that time someone was standing behind the door and heard all these shouts. Charlie was hopelessly trying to take at least one artifact from the man when suddenly the door opened, and a red-haired guy appeared on the threshold of the apartment. Harry asked who the guy was, and Charlie started to break out in a cold sweat and quietly called the guy's name, calling him Scott. Scott's face darkened and he asked again who he was. And then he himself answered that he was the owner of this apartment, and suddenly his blue aura burst out. Hearing this, the man immediately calmed down, and the entire apartment was in chaos with broken artifacts. Meanwhile, Victor was already at his residence. He, in shock, asked again about the Korean avatars having disappeared. The subordinate, who was kneeling in front of the stairs, replied that this was indeed the case, and that it had caused a great deal of fuss in Korea. Gritting his teeth, Victor wondered who could have done something like this. He thought that the avatars were direct representatives of sacred entities, and therefore only someone unusually strong could disperse them. The man told his subordinate to contact the other saints and ask them if she had anything to do with this. The subordinate replied that he understood, but the shooter had not been in touch for a long time, to which the man replied that this was no cause for concern, since Hugo had warned that he was going to get a new position in the UK. The subordinate then said that they were informed that upon arrival at the UK airport, he immediately transferred to another flight. This made Victor turn around and he asked where the man was heading, to which he was told that Hugo had gone to South Korea. Victor thought, rubbing his chin with his hand. He thought that Hugo was on good terms with Harry. So could his actions be connected to tears about the return of that bastard? Could it be that he actually survived? The man cursed quietly and grabbed the candelabra. And then he shouted that this was all ridiculous nonsense and threw the candelabra at the floor, which his subordinate barely managed to dodge. Victor cried out for him to report to him more clearly, and then he asked what else was there. The man replied that an unconscious branching Templar had been found at the place where the avatars had disappeared. He was lying in the middle of the street wearing only his underwear. And also, according to witnesses, before this he got into a fight with a handsome young man. Victor latched onto the word handsome, and then he assumed that it couldn't be Harry, since his face was covered in scars. He thought that things weren't going too well anyway, and it was entirely possible that he had managed to get out alive. For some unknown reason, the Korean avatars disappeared, and what's worse is that they failed to finish off the Spider Queen. Victor clenched his fist tightly, thinking that at this rate his position could be in jeopardy. And then he ordered that his plane be prepared, to which his subordinate raised his head and asked him if he was really going to go there personally. The man answered in the affirmative and said that he wanted to see everything with his own eyes. He grabbed a coat that was lying nearby and swung it around, throwing it over his shoulders. He frowned and said that he absolutely had to see for himself all this hell that was going on in Korea. And he walked forward, lighting a cigar. Meanwhile, the member of the twin branching was taken to the twin branching hospital in Korea. The man was lying on a bed with sensors attached to his chest, and on his face he had a breathing mask. An old man approached the man's bed. His hair was gray and his head was almost bald. His face had age spots. The old man exclaimed, asking who dared to harm his grandson. When no one answered him, he turned to the man standing against the wall, and the man said that there was no need to worry so much. The man replied that the saint of the Gemini constellation had sent him specifically to sort this out. This man's name was Mike. He was a Templar of the S-class of the Gemini branching. Meanwhile, Harry and Charlie told Scott everything, and he asked again whether they had really met at the demonic tower. He continued asking about the events, clearly not believing them, and Charlie just nodded in panic, sweat running down his face. Scott screamed at him to stop lying to him, and besides, the man had destroyed all of his artifacts, to which Harry said they were fakes anyway. The guy asked the man what branch he was from, to which the man asked him if he really thought he needed something like that. Then, an irritated Scott asked what god he believed in then, to which Harry replied that he didn't need those 12 idiots. The guy asked his rank, to which he also did not receive a normal answer. Then, he decided to ask his name. The man, also irritated, replied that his name was Harry. Scott could no longer stand this irritation, and Charlie hastened to calm him down. The guy's blue aura swirled around him, and he said that the man had broken into someone else's house without permission and destroyed all the relics. The light from the aura became even brighter, and a figure appeared above his head as he exclaimed that this bastard still dared to call himself by the name of the Great Harry. Charlie called Scott again, yelling at him not to destroy their apartment. An alert went out that a magical outburst from a follower of the twins had been detected, and Harry said that it looked like this tough guy was determined to destroy this house. The man then activated one of his new skills, God's Gaze. Then, information appeared that Scott was a follower of the A-rank twins. His nickname was Crushing Blow. Information appeared about his skills and personal traits, and the most important was his trait Genius, thanks to which the effective training was 200%. Harry thought that at such a young age the boy already possessed high-ranking skills. The trait of Genius was clearly not just for nothing. A figure appeared above the boy's head and screamed loudly, causing his eyes to glow blue. Trying to defend himself, Charlie shouted at the man to run as fast as he could, as Scott was a high-ranking Templar and also a crazy fan of Harry. Scott then asked the guy if he was crazy, and then told him to get out of his way if he didn't want to get swatted. But the man suddenly appeared behind him with a grin on his face and said that the guy was playing with fire so hard that he was in danger of peeing his pants. Hearing his voice behind him, the guy immediately hurried to turn around. But when he did, the man immediately sent him flying with his flick. Scott fell to the floor, his blue aura fading. And the man said that at this rate, this idiot would have burned down not only his apartment, but the entire house. Charlie asked in a panic if he was okay, to which Harry replied with a grin that everything was great. However, this did not completely convince the guy, and he looked at his friend uncertainly. Meanwhile, Scott lay unconscious on the floor, with a huge bump on his forehead and foam coming out of his mouth. Harry went to his room to take a nap, and Charlie began to slow down Scott so that he would wake up. The man entered one of the rooms and slowly closed the door, and then he froze and stopped at the door, looking around the room. The entire table was covered with hairy figurines. The man with a darkened face asked what it was, to which Charlie said that he had said that Scott was obsessed with Harry, and the guy, who had already woken up, asked him to be careful with the figurines. But the man immediately broke one of them, saying that they irritated him, and therefore he needed to at least tear off the head. Charlie tried to drag his friend out the door while he screamed at the man that he was a fucking psycho, to which the man responded that he was Harry, not a fucking psycho. Scott screamed hysterically, tears running from his eyes and snot from his nose, his face twisted in pain. Meanwhile, someone was sitting in one of the cafes in Korea. News reports indicated that yesterday afternoon, 2 members of the twin lineage were attacked by an as-yet unidentified individual with the stated intent of stealing items. Hugo, who was sitting at the table, covered his face with his hand, thinking that this was definitely Harry's doing. And what was he thinking? The waitress approached the man and, with a smile on her face, asked him if he was ready to order. But the man irritably told her that Victor should stop this clown show and get out of here. Victor, in the body of a waitress, answered with a grin that he had figured him out too quickly, and therefore it was not interesting. And then he said that he hadn't been able to contact him for a long time, and therefore was glad to see him. He leaned on the man's shoulder and said that, judging by his hasty arrival in Korea, he came here because of Harry, and therefore he should tell him everything. Hugo snapped his fingers and said that this is exactly why he hates this pervert who steals people's bodies. The girl's body jerked in response to this, and she came to her senses. And then she asked, confused, what she had just done. The man slammed his fist on the table and thought about how he needed to get to Harry as quickly as possible. The next day, Charlie and Scott went to the hypermarket. Charlie asked his friend if the man could really be Harry, to which he replied that he looked completely different. And then he cried out that Harry is also a hero of humanity. He can't be such a redneck. To which the guy replied that he definitely saw him coming out of the demonic tower, and his strength was amazing. But Scott only answered once again with confidence that this couldn't be, because his father had told him so. And then he quickly hushed up the subject. Suddenly someone shouted that there was a thief here, and the guy stopped, looking around. And then something suddenly knocked them off their feet and turned over their cart. As it turned out, it was that same thief. Falling to the floor, Charlie noticed that he was very fast, which meant that he was from the Scorpio branch, and his friend said that he was wasting his powers on bad things. The thief began to rush quickly from side to side, stealing everything he could. The thief thought that these pathetic Templars could never catch up with him. He gritted his teeth, thinking that he had already made enough money, and therefore it was time for him to go. But before he could do so, someone hit him in the stomach, stopping him. The blow caused the man's eyes to open wide and turn red, and drool began to flow from his mouth. It turned out to be Harry, and Charlie asked him what he was doing there, to which he replied that he had forgotten to tell them to buy some chicken. Then someone told the man that he was very good, since he was able to catch a member of the Scorpion branch, considering their speed. It turned out it was Mike, and he said that the man was just an ordinary follower, and therefore it would be better to call the police next time. Harry looked at the man and wondered what kind of guy he was. But the next moment everything behind them shook, causing the men to turn away from each other. The rest of the people in the hypermarket were also scared by this shaking. The thief, who had already come to his senses, thought that this was an excellent chance for him to escape, and then he quickly rushed forward towards the doors. He thought that he could have been caught because of this strange man. But the earthquake came in handy. But suddenly he noticed that the floor in front of him began to crack. He managed to stop, and the next moment a huge monster in the form of a centipede jumped out of the ground. The thief raised his head and asked why the attractant appeared in the green zone. He took a step back, thinking that he needed to get out of here before it was too late. And then he jumped high into the air. The man grinned and thought that, even though this creature was strong, it would never be able to catch up with him. But at that very moment, a monster's wide-open mouth appeared at the side of the man, causing the man's face to freeze. The monster devoured the man, and then he sank to the ground, and the crowd could only watch. And, as it turned out, there was someone sitting on the monster's back. The Spider Queen looked coldly at the crowd below with her red eyes. A message came from the loudspeakers that an emergency had occurred. A bad guy had appeared in the hypermarket, and everyone needed to return to the building immediately. Meanwhile, the monster rushed at the crowd, which was running away in panic to return to the building, and a voice announced that due to the invasion of the Spider Queen, this zone was turning red. The alarm was still sounding. People were panicking and trying to escape, and one little boy stopped in the middle of the road crying loudly. The monster's mouth opened wide, and he was about to devour this easy prey. But before that happened, Harry landed on the monster's head. The boy froze, looking at his savior, his body shaking slightly, and Harry told him that he should be more careful. The man extended his hand to him with a smile on his face, his eyes shining with a turquoise light, and he asked if he was hurt. But the next moment the boy rushed forward, running away from his savior. The man cleared his throat awkwardly and said that the boy seemed to be okay. Rising to his feet, he asked what this giant was doing here. The monsters began to pounce on the man, and then a turquoise snake began to form next to him. The snake's head appeared next to him, and the man asked about how today he would be able to have fun for the first time in a long time. Meanwhile, the black car was driving quickly along the road. Victor, who was sitting in this car, asked his subordinate to repeat it. The subordinate said again that the creatures that brought misfortune appeared in the middle of the hypermarket, to which the man asked him to repeat the name of that creature. Then he said that they were told that it was the Spider Queen. Hearing this again, Victor thought about how they had failed during the raid, and he had barely managed to put the seal. Had she already escaped? Clenching his fist, he thought that there was no way he could defeat a red-class monster on his own. After the appearance of the wallpapers that bring misfortune, they began to divide locations into 6 classes according to the level of danger, where the blue zone is a blessed abode. Green zone is a safe zone. The yellow zone is a zone of slight danger. The orange zone is the zone of monsters that pose a great threat to life. And the red zone is the zone where deadly monsters have gathered. The black zone is a zone where life is impossible. Since the Spider Queen has appeared in hypermarkets, it is now a red zone. Victor's driver asked him what they should do now. After a short silence, the man replied that they needed to seal everything. He thought that no one should know anything. If the public knew about the failure of the last raid, they would lose their reputation. In a bit of a panic, Victor told her subordinate to tell them that they could no longer save those inside, and to send the Templars to completely seal off the building. Meanwhile, some bubbling sounds continued to be heard in the hypermarket. The monsters continued to advance in numerous hordes. Mike put his hands out in front of him, and everything around him was illuminated by a cold light, and he exhaled steam from his mouth. He dropped to the ground and touched it with his hands, causing it to freeze, and this ice moved towards the monsters. The ice reached the monsters and they found themselves bound by it. The man, wiping sweat from his face, told them not to dare underestimate them. But the next moment, a crack appeared in the ice. And then, with a furious roar, the monster broke through its icy cage. Panicked, Mike wondered how they had managed to do it so easily. But suddenly Harry appeared in front of him with tin cans in his hands. Mike wondered when the man had managed to get here. Tossing one of the cans, Harry said with a grin on his face that these bastards must be really hungry, since they decided to feast on people. And then he quickly waved his hand, and all the jars that were in his hands flew at the monsters. However, this only made the monsters even more angry. But then something cut the monster in half. Harry rushed forward, cutting through the monsters that were in his path, and he cried out, asking them if they knew who they were opening their mouths on. The man's eyes glowed green as the monsters' bodies fell to the ground, and he said that normal mobs should know their place. Scott and Charlie stared at this with their mouths open. Suddenly, a message appeared in front of the man's face, stating that he had destroyed the attractor. There were reports that he had increased the Divine Throne EXP and obtained a consumable material. A sparkling shard appeared on the man's hand, and a message appeared stating that consumables could be used to create new skills and relics. Clutching the shard in his hand, the man thought that despite the 50% penalty to his physical capabilities, moving didn't seem that difficult, and perhaps he could use even more energy than before. Mike thought that it was impossible for a man to easily destroy S-class monsters that even he couldn't stop. Harry approached Scott to return the knife he had taken from his house. Mike didn't take his eyes off him and wondered where he came from. But suddenly he remembered something, and then he called out to Harry, calling him an amateur, and he turned his head. And then he cried out that he was the same man who had attacked their followers, and Harry, hearing this, shuddered. And he immediately remembered the couple he had recently beaten up. But then he hit the man in the face, telling him to shut up. Mike fell to the ground from the blow, and his body shook slightly. Harry asked him how he guessed. Mike exclaimed again, asking him how he could not recognize him. And then he pointed out that the man had put on the clothes and badge of the man he had beaten. And he said that this badge is an S-rank relic given only to the Templars of the Twin Branch. And then he cried out that he was sure that all the man's strength was hidden in this badge, and Harry only disgustedly took it off himself and asked how this nasty thing ended up on him. And then he squeezed the badge with his fingers, destroying the abomination. Seeing this, Mike became even more angry. Dusting his hands, Harry said that the relic was nothing more than a decoration, and he couldn't believe that those bastards hadn't changed a bit in 20 years. But suddenly, a furious cry of a monster sounded next to them. Harry immediately put on a serious face and looked towards the sound. Charlie also looked in that direction and pointed at something with his shaking finger. As it turned out, it was the Spider Queen, who was riding a monster and chasing people. Then the men tensed up and Harry's body was covered in green light. And then this light became even brighter, and streams of wind gathered around it. And a second later, he was already rushing forward. He rushed straight towards the Spider Queen. Flying closer, he raised his hand and struck at the head of the monster on which the queen was. From this blow, the monster immediately fell to the ground, breaking the stone covering. People looked around in panic at the loud sound. Mike was also watching this, but he had absolutely no idea what the hell was going on. It seemed completely insane to him that the man would rush at this monster without any relic on him. Suddenly, a voice was heard in his ears, calling for the attention of all the Templars of the Gemini branch. Scott and Mike, who heard the voice, immediately realized that it was Bishop Simon. Simon told Scott and Mike to get out of that building immediately. He said that the people from the Aries branch intend to completely seal the building. He said that Victor was already on his way here, and they couldn't stop him. And besides, even a saint couldn't cope with the Spider Queen. That's why they decided to get rid of the place completely, because the saints would get into trouble if people found out about their failure. He asked Mike if he had a teleportation skill, and then he told him to take Scott and get out of there. The man's eyes began to dart nervously around the building. People were injured and some could barely move on their own. Everything was almost resolved, but the monsters continued to crawl out of the crevice, and only Harry still fought with the Spider Queen. The man's body suddenly began to tremble. Simon asked him if there was any problem with them leaving together. With a crazy face, Mike replied that there was no problem. Scott cried out, asking what he was talking about. The outside help was clearly not enough. Didn't he understand how badly they were stuck? He asked him if he really wanted to leave all these people to die. After a short silence, the man replied that he understood everything. But what will people think when the Spider Queen appears in the middle of the city? Hearing this question, the guy froze and asked again. Mike replied that then people would begin to reproach the branches of the constellations, and their faith would weaken. And because of this, their strength would also waver. He took out his phone and said that he could only take one person with him, and Scott would go with him, since he was ordered to save him. Scott cried out that he couldn't leave his friend here to die, and besides, a lot of people hadn't had time to evacuate yet. The man gritted his teeth and said that now was not the time for his whims. He said he had no desire to die here because of an incompetent freak like him. And the man's hand began to turn into ice. Steam from the ice swirled around him, and he said he would have to kill all the extra cargo so the guy wouldn't have much of a choice. These words angered the guy, and a blue light appeared around him. The guy stood in a stance, and flashes of blue light flew around him. Coming closer, Mike asked him if he was really going to fight him. He said they were on completely different levels and he needed to put his miserable conscience aside and make a rational decision. But before he could say anything else, something hit him in the back. As it turned out, it was the paw of a monster that was now pressing the man to the ground. Harry landed next to her on the ground and wondered why they were still here. He said that it was dangerous here, and therefore they should leave quickly. Charlie called out to the man happily, and Scott said that the draggers had blocked the exit so they couldn't get out of here. The guy said they should either use the teleporter or destroy all the monsters here. Looking around, the guy noted that there were currently a lot of wounded in the building, and the people from the Aries branch decided to seal the entire building. Harry swore in response, saying that it was just a headache, and Mike began to crawl out from under the rubble with groaning sounds. With a sudden movement, he rose to his feet, scattering the debris around him, and then he shouted, telling Harry to come to him. Harry said that he thought the man had already chickened out and ran away at the speed of light, to which the man shouted at him to shut up. Mike grabbed the phone and shouted that they would see who could get out of here alive, and maybe he could get out alone. But before he could press the button to teleport away, a web appeared behind him. As it turned out, it was the Spider Queen who launched a web at the man, grabbing him. Mike turned around in panic and swore quietly. Then the monster pulled on its web, throwing the man into its mouth. The phone fell out of his hands and hit the ground with a dull thud. Harry, without a second's delay, turned to the boys standing behind him. Turning around, he told them to take care of the wounded, and he would sort everything out here, and then he would join them. A green light enveloped his body as he said it wouldn't take long. Meanwhile, the Ares branching barrier continued to surround the building. Victor had already arrived at the scene, and he asked his subordinate about the current situation, to which he replied that their people had already practically sealed off the hypermarket. The building was cordoned off. Victor asked if the work was going too slowly, considering that they had started it long before his arrival. The branching people who created the barrier asked why the protection was not holding up properly, as if something was about to break out. And at that very moment, a bright light illuminated the entire building. This caused a wind to rise, and Victor's subordinates began to defend their commander. And the next moment, a huge turquoise snake burst out of the building. Victor exclaimed, asking what the hell was going on here. Where did the snake come from? People ran out of the hypermarket with frightened screams. This crowd was met by Victor's subordinates, and the crowd screamed for help, and they said that there was some guy there alone fighting with the queen. Hearing this, Victor wondered what they were talking about, because even he alone could not contain such monsters. And then he stepped forward and said that he would see with his own eyes, in response to which his subordinates exclaimed that it was dangerous. But this did not stop the man. And the next moment, a gust of wind arose, and the man's figure became blurry. Victor jumped up sharply, pushing off the walls of the building. He jumped into one of the broken windows. He looked up and saw something that shocked him, and he swore quietly. As it turned out, what he saw was the lifeless body of the Spider Queen. The man's face twisted into a frightened expression as he wondered who could have done such a thing. Looking around, he noticed that there was a real massacre here. He wondered what it was, whether someone was deliberately hunting the Spider Queen. Clutching his head, he said that with every second his headache was getting worse and that he already had enough problems. Suddenly, he felt a familiar energy and looked somewhere to the side. Following this energy, the man ran to the window to see who it belonged to. Looking out the window, he saw a familiar figure and wondered what that bastard was doing here. As it turned out, that bastard was Hugo, who had already arrived in Korea. He stepped one foot on the edge and wondered if this could all have been Hugo's doing. Then it would make sense. But then a voice came from behind him, asking if he missed him, and it made the man's body shudder. Harry, who appeared behind him, his eyes sparkling, asked him what was the matter, what was wrong. He asked him with a smirk on his face what that expression was, since they hadn't seen each other for so long. Victor immediately hurried to turn around to look at the other, but he was too shocked to utter a word. Meanwhile, rescuers arrived at the hypermarket and began evacuating people, and Charlie and Scott were sitting on the ground, wrapped in blankets. Scott wondered if the man could really be Harry, because even though he looked different, his movements were definitely similar. Suddenly, someone shouted Scott's name. As it turned out, it was a breathless Hugo who asked the guy what he was doing. Turning away from the man, the boy asked him what he was doing there, to which he responded by asking if that was the right way to greet one's own father. Hearing this, Charlie laughed, and Scott just clicked his tongue in irritation. Hugo took his chin in his hand thoughtfully, looking cautiously at his son. And then he said that at least he was not hurt, and a little medical attention would quickly return him to action. And then he asked him if he saw who did all this to the monsters, since he was in the building when it happened. But instead of answering, Scott only turned away from his father even more, and the man thought irritably about who he got his character from. And the guy asked his friend if everything would be okay with Harry. Hearing this, the man ran up to Charlie and grabbed him sharply by the shoulders, and then he cried out, asking the guy if he really knew Harry, and the guy asked again, not understanding. And then the guy said that now he understood who the man meant. When he called him by this strange nickname, it turned out it was Hugo. And then he said that the man was in the hypermarket right now, and by the way, he defeated the Spider Queen, and he introduced himself to them as Harry. The man, still holding the boy by the shoulders, told him to describe everything in more detail. But before the guy could say anything, a loud sound was heard in the building and something hit the wall. Meanwhile, Victor was fighting with Harry. He jumped away from him, already out of breath. Harry was absolutely fine, and he said it was too much. Wiping his face with his hand, he said that they met for the first time in 20 years, and the first thing the man decided to do was attack him. Victor asked the man how he managed to survive it all, and then he looked at his face and thought that the man looked very much like Harry. But where were his ugly scars? And his voice was different from before. He thought about how he looked too young, and then Victor shouted at him about how this little bastard dared to imitate Harry, and he even got worried for a moment. Harry asked again, uncomprehendingly. Victor screamed that this bastard dared to deceive him, and therefore he would pay for it with his life, while Harry calmly asked what he was even talking about. And then he hit him in the stomach with a sharp movement, screaming that all this time he had been profiting from others, deceiving them. The man quickly flew back from this blow, but Harry didn't stop there. and with a quick movement he found himself behind the man to strike again. He hit the man again and he flew straight into the ground. Lying on the ground, Victor began to make muffled sounds, and Harry lowered himself to the ground and began to approach him. He said that he needed to teach each of them a good lesson, and then he asked about how he had lived while he was imprisoned in the demonic tower. He asked and said that they had appropriated his relics and wealth, and even divided his will. Clenching his fist in his hand, he said with a smile on his face that it was okay. He was going to finish them all off anyway. He began to list the order in which he would destroy everything he had, and the man began to shake with fear. Harry exclaimed that he would destroy everything he held dear, and it seemed to hit Victor hard on the head. He gritted his teeth and thought that this couldn't be happening. As he rose to his feet, he thought that the man was not bluffing, because his manner of behavior and speech were so similar, and he could not even recognize his movements. Could he really be that Harry? Could he really have escaped from the demonic tower? Victor stood up and said that all this was nonsense, and then everything was illuminated with a red light and Victor's body rose above the ground. Swords began to appear from behind him, and the man told the other to prove to him that he was the same Harry. A magic circle with an image of Ares appeared under Victor, and swords appeared from the portal behind his back. Then a hat and mantle appeared on the man's body, like those of the emperors of ancient dynasties. A message has emerged that the sacred entity of the Aries constellation, the Jade Emperor, has revealed itself. Harry chuckled and asked if even a holy being had decided to honor him with its presence. Victor raised his finger, pointing at the man, his eyes glowing red, and red chains grew out of the ground around Harry. These chains began to wrap around his body, restricting his movements. Victor asked him if he still considered them weaklings. A wave of swords flew through the air, and the man said that he did not know how the other managed to survive in that tower. Victor raised his hands to the sky, preparing to use the heavenly weapon to attack the chained Harry. A multitude of swords rushed towards Harry in waves. Harry said with an emotionless face that the Emperor's power was really amazing. Victor waved his hand, shouting for him to shut up, and the swords sped up. And the swords flew in a furious stream straight at Harry. A multitude of swords fell upon the man, causing them to form a whole mountain. Victor, trying to catch his breath, thought about whether he had succeeded. He slowly began to approach closer, saying that it was amazing that he managed to get out of the demonic tower. But his self-confidence did not go away. Stopping in front of the mountain of swords, he said that challenging someone who had gained experience all these years through his followers was such a reckless thing. He chuckled and asked if he really thought they had been standing still for 20 years. But suddenly a bright light began to burst out from under the mountain of swords. Noticing this, Victor immediately thought that this could not be. And then the bright flash flared up even more, and some force began to break the swords. As it turned out, it was Harry, who quickly broke free from the swords and rushed forward to punch the man in the face. The blow sent Victor flying back to the ground, his teeth knocked out and his nose bleeding as he wondered how the man had managed to survive. If he really was that Harry. Harry's shirt was torn to shreds. His body was covered in scars, and he stepped on it, angrily asking the man if he finally recognized him. And then Harry exclaimed that he had returned for their souls, and therefore they should prepare for the worst. Holding his nose, he said that even his weapon smelled like shit, while his wounds gradually healed. Noticing this, Victor thought that such a level of regeneration was impossible, even for Aquarius with her skills as a healer. Reports surfaced that Harry had survived death again, and that the power of the 13th skill was now unlocked. And Harry chuckled and thanked the man for making him stronger. His eyes flashed with an evil light as he asked why he didn't try his new skill. Energy emanated from his body, tearing apart everything that came near him. And Victor, raising his shaking hands, begged him to stop. But then there are reports that the sacred entity of Ares is watching Harry in shock, and the sacred entity is condemning Victor, asking why he is still alive. He says that this should not have happened. And then the sacred entity quickly leaves, shouting curses. Victor shook his head, shouting questions about why this sacred entity had left him, and Harry only asked with a smile whether he had really left before it was all over. He flexed his fists in irritation and, still smiling, said that he was so merciful that he would let him feel the pain that he himself had experienced. Meanwhile, Victor's men had already arrived at the destroyed building. One of them looked around and noticed something, and so asked what had happened here. As it turned out, there were many corpses of monsters lying on their path. Hugo, who entered the building with the others, suddenly felt something. His eyes lit up with a bright light as he felt a familiar energy. As it turned out, it was he who felt Victor's energy. He sighed, thinking that this was definitely Harry's doing. He was always causing trouble. And in the meantime, others had noticed Victor's energy. One of them asked why his energy had weakened so much, and the other wanted to suggest something. But Hugo appeared behind him, drawing his bow, and he asked everyone to step back. The arrow shot forward and there was an explosion where it landed. Soon the entire building was filled with smoke, but Hugo continued to hang in the air. Landing on the ground, he quickly straightened his jacket, and the flashes that emanated from his body died down. He looked down somewhere and then quietly cursed at Harry. He looked at Victor's body, which was unconscious, and on his chest was a note that said, "Gone to the pigsty." Meanwhile, Harry had gotten himself some new clothes, and he was already standing in front of the stairs that led to Victor's house. Stopping, he said that this is where all his stolen relics were kept. He walked inside and there were a lot of people who had come to look at the exhibits. The man thought that he could smell his relics coming from somewhere. Coming closer, he noted that they were all fakes. The clothes were stolen from his house, but the screaming was definitely fake. Next, he got to the exhibit, which was a toothpick that he had used before. Pressing his hands to the glass, Harry exclaimed with a smile that he had finally found her. After some time, a siren sounded throughout the room, and people began to look around in fear. Bright red lights came on and a loud sound filled the building. The security guards ran in a friendly crowd to Sector B, where the robber was located. Meanwhile, Harry had already broken the display case and pulled out his toothpick. At some distance from him, a whole crowd of guards gathered, who ordered him to raise his hands up, slowly put the object down and surrender. A light shone around the boy's body as he said that he didn't really feel like doing it. And then, with a slight movement of his hand, he waved the toothpick in his hands, and some force lifted all the guards up, and the man walked forward. Looking at the toothpick, he said that old things were much better than new ones, and meanwhile the shouts of the guards were heard. Suddenly, a pink ball with a face appeared on the man's hand, and the man said he was glad to see it, and it turned out to be a relic of the S-class, a lump of slime that can recreate anything. The slime ball happily snuggled up to the man, and a message appeared stating that the conditions for obtaining the skill Creation Workshop had been met, and he could now create a workshop that was 17 square feet in size, and he could now bestow his trait on the slime ball. A lump of slime settled on Harry's shoulder, and he asked him if they should head for the exit. Suddenly, a message appeared that a strong aura of the relic of the constellation Aries was felt nearby, and some door began to shine brightly to the side. The man said that he felt a bit sorry to leave empty-handed. As he reached for the door handle, he said it was an exciting moment to receive the award. Meanwhile, Hugo reached Victor's estate, but looking around, he asked if he was late. Everything around was in chaos. Victor's house was burning, and people were running away in a panic. Noticing him, Hugo prayed that Harry wouldn't do something worse. Meanwhile, Harry, with a huge bag in his hand which he dragged along the ground, left the estate saying that he was hungry. Hugo noticed him immediately and called him by name. Hearing someone calling him, Harry looked up and immediately saw a man. Hugo quickly ran forward, tears streaming down his cheeks, and shouted that he was a bastard. Harry was about to meet him, but then the man ran past him. Hugo grabbed some guy by the shoulders and asked him what he was doing here and where he had been all this time. He needed to find him since he had returned. Noticing this, Harry angrily clenched his fur coats, and the lump of slime looked at its owner in fear. And then he jumped up and kicked the man right in the face, asking him how he could not recognize someone's face. Hugo sank to the ground, his body shaking a little. Harry stood in front of him, towering over him, and asked him how he could not recognize him. Did he want to die? Holding his cheek, Hugo looked up in confusion, and then he noticed a clot of mucus on the man's shoulder. Harry raised his fist, saying that it looked like he still needed another punch. But then Hugo jumped to his feet and quickly rushed forward, hugging the other. Tears and snot ran down his face as he exclaimed that he had been alive all this time. But a second later, Harry hit the man in the stomach. Hugo sank to the ground again. Harry asked him how he dared to attack him like that, to which the man noted that he was definitely Harry. Suddenly, a message appeared that the sacred entity of the Sagittarius constellation, Apollo, had revealed himself. And then a bright light flashed behind Hugo, and a man appeared. Hugo immediately turned around, completely not understanding what was happening. The sacred entity rose above the men and looked down on them, and they wondered why he had suddenly appeared. Apollo rubbed his chin thoughtfully, looking at Harry. A report has emerged that the sacred entity of the Sagittarius constellation is doubting the veracity of Harry's survival. A message appeared that the sacred entity offered to verify this, to which Hugo asked him how he was going to do this. A message appeared that the sacred entity Apollo was pointing his arrow at Harry, saying that everything would become clear when he shot him, in response to which Hugo grabbed the man, shouting that this was not right, and Harry angrily said that he should just get rid of the bum. He indignantly asked about the fact that he decided to point a gun at him first, in response to which Hugo rushed forward, grabbed the guy by the shoulders and told him not to take it to his head, and he did not want to insult him, while Apollo stuck his tongue out at the other man from behind his back. Harry said that since everything was fine, they should continue where they started, and Hugo pulled away, uncomprehending. And then Harry repeated the words he had told him on the phone. A demon appeared behind Harry and said that when he returned from the tower, he found that his house had been sold, his property had been appropriated, and the relics had disappeared somewhere. Hugo called out to the man uncertainly. He continued, telling him to let him hit him once. Harry still hit the man, causing a bump to appear on his head. And then Hugo was finally convinced that it was Harry in front of him, but he thought that this freak had hit him hard. Meanwhile, guards ran out of the mansion shouting that they needed to return the stolen relics. Harry seemed to have just remembered that he was being chased, and Hugo asked him incredulously about what he had stolen. Pointing to his huge bag, the man said he had only stolen a couple of trinkets. Looking at the bag, Hugo exclaimed, asking the man if he really stole the relics from Victor's vault, to which he asked if that was really cool. Hugo rushed towards him, asking what was so cool about it, and Harry just laughed. One of the guards said that they needed to catch the thief right away, to which his superior replied that they couldn't handle him. And then he said that this bastard definitely wouldn't be able to cope with him, even though everyone considered him quite strong. Then the guard decided to suggest something. But before he could do so, there were sounds behind Hugo and Harry, and the former immediately turned around. As it turned out, someone jumped from the roof of the mansion. The head of security noticed that he was already here. A message appeared that the avatar of the Aries constellation, Pishu, had been discovered, and a warning appeared that he could steal his money and relics. The huge beast opened its mouth, from which came a loud roar. The men looked up at him and Hugo swore under his breath. Afterwards, he suggested that the man leave all the stolen things and run away from there, to which he told him to just stand and watch. And then he grinned and said he had a plan. Harry turned to the slime ball named Lime, and he ordered him to give him the knife. Lime's eyes immediately lit up and the outline of a knife appeared in them. And then a knife handle appeared from his mouth. Harry grabbed the handle and swung the knife sharply, searching for it from the clot of slime. Looking at the knife, he thought that it wouldn't be suitable for fighting an avatar in this state. And then he told the knife to show its true form, and black lightning flashed around the man and a bright light appeared. Gusts of wind blew towards Hugo, and he shielded himself from them with his hand, wondering what kind of force this was. Meanwhile, a huge blade stuck into the stone of the platform. As it turned out, that small knife turned into a huge sword with a long blade. There have been reports that the awakened relic is imbued with the aura of the serpent bearer, and the relic has gained more deadly characteristics due to the serpent hunter trait. There were reports that the power of the 13th had been strengthened. He could now see the weak points of his opponents. He was discovering the path of death. Harry happily noted that he had received a new skill, and he immediately decided to use it, causing the whites of his eyes to turn black and his irises to glow a bright turquoise light. He immediately noticed how some places on the beast's body began to glow. Harry quickly jumped up, raising his sword to strike, and he exclaimed that it was time for him to stretch a bit. Hugo, who stood aside and watched, said that rushing at the enemy without thinking was the man's favorite tactic. He always overcame obstacles despite all his recklessness. It made him smile a little and he thought that Harry was really back. The avatar meanwhile swung his huge paw, pinning the man to the ground. This caused Hugo to open his eyes wide and call out Harry's name in concern. But then the beast's paw began to shake slightly, and Harry asked why the man was so confused. With a slight movement of his hand, Gary lifted the beast's paw, saying that he almost died from the stench. And then he chuckled, asking if it was really his turn now. Looking at the man, the beast suddenly froze in fear. A second later, Harry swung his sword, sending the beast's severed paw flying high into the air. Feeling intense pain, the avatar screamed furiously. A warning has appeared that the Beast of Plenty is using its skill. And then the loud roar of the beast was heard again, and a message appeared that Pishu was absorbing all valuables that fell within the radius of action. But Harry held the sword in front of him, exclaiming that now the beast would definitely not escape punishment. He raised his hands, raising his sword behind his back, and a message appeared that the Ophiuchus trait had been activated. The man looked at the beast with glowing eyes and decided that one light cut should be enough. And then he swung his sword sharply, using his trait, and something black rushed towards the beast. The black sword swing immediately flew towards the avatar, smashing the ground. And then it hit the beast right on the chest, the cut running diagonally across the entire chest. The blow was so strong that it affected not only the beast, but also everything behind it for several hundred meters. Now there was a huge furrow in the ground from the impact, and Victor's mansion was destroyed. In surprise, Hugo unconsciously raised his hand to cover his mouth, which had opened slightly. Looking at the man standing next to the beast's body, he thought that this power was comparable to what he had in his prime. There were reports that the man had defeated the Avatar, and his sacred throne experience had been increased. The question arose, does he want to receive the Beast of Abundance as his avatar? Coming closer, Harry said that he thought only 12 saints could have avatars, and then he raised his hand to touch the beast's body. The avatar's body was immediately enveloped in light and slowly rose into the air. His wings immediately spread out. The beast immediately returned to normal. There were reports that the beast Pishu became the avatar of the constellation Ophiuchus, the current number of avatars. 1. A message appeared that Pishu had shrunk in size to hug his owner, and the man picked up the animal, which now looked like a soft toy. Harry exclaimed that it would be great to use the beast as a repository for his relics, and the man happily spun around with Pishu in his hands. And Hugo wondered when the man had managed to acquire such a skill to appropriate an avatar from another branch. A message appeared telling Harry to choose a new name for the beast, and he froze strangely. And then he shouted that he would name the beast Pigbank. After some time, Hugo and Harry reached the former's house, and Harry called the man a traitor, to which he cried out that he was actually very worried. To which Harry replied that he was so worried that he started a family and enjoyed life. Continuing to twist something in the toy horse, he began to wail, which only made Hugo clench his fist in irritation. Harry got up from the couch, saying that he didn't want to bother the man with his presence, to which Hugo replied that everything was fine and he could stay here since he was alone anyway. The man then said that he shouldn't have brought up the subject to him because it was probably too much for a man to talk about divorce, to which Hugo cried out that he wasn't divorced. Covering his face with his hand, he said that they needed to continue where they left off, and then he asked him about what happened inside the demonic tower, and he himself thought about how he shouldn't tell his family about Harry because they were crazy about him. Hugo said that he stayed outside during that raid and therefore didn't know what happened inside, and he asked about why the others came back with the red-eyed man's head, to which Harry replied that it was a very touching story. He said he was stabbed in the back and left to die in a tower, trapped in a monster-infested trap, and among the hordes of these creatures, the red-eyed one, whom he thought was dead, returned to life. Hugo asked again in surprise, to which Harry replied that what they saw during the raid was not his real body. The real difference lay deep within, and even though he managed to win, the main pain in the ass was not the red-eyed one, but the tower administrator, who revived all the killed monsters again and again, but he continued to chop them down. Having finished off the last of them, he collapsed to the ground from exhaustion, and then he was already dead. But then, opening his eyes, he discovered that he had somehow found himself outside the tower, and at that moment he was filled with this strange power. But he is sure of one thing, namely that the bastard who stabbed him then was well aware of the structure of the tower, and therefore he threw him into that lair, knowing exactly what would happen to him. Harry said that sooner or later he would get to those who had appropriated his property, and the bastard who had stabbed him in the neck had received a special punishment, and so he needed to be well prepared. The man said that he needed to make the server equipment, and then he released the toy horse into the air, and it hung in the air, enveloped by the man's power. There were reports that natural materials for making had been discovered, and the question arose as to whether he wanted to use them to create the relic. Suitable materials included the core of a spider queen, a fragment of a bad luck charm, and relics of the Aries constellation were also discovered. Harry looked at the materials and said that perhaps he should mix them all together. He raised his hand forward and the creation of a new relic began. A bright light shone from the windows of Hugo's house. There have been reports that a new B-class relic has been created. A new entity has been recreated. Grabbing the relic in his hands, Harry noted that relics with their own essences are capable of developing on their own. Hugo clapped in admiration, and then he took a closer look at it and said that, considering that it was a very valuable relic, its design was simply disgusting. Then Harry responded by shouting that he had poured so much material into this relic, and he still dared to mock? Turning away from the man, he said that he had thought about making something for him too. But now he suddenly changed his mind. Then Hugo grabbed the man by the shoulder and said that he was just a master relic maker. And by disgusting, he meant that he simply could not feel the full aesthetics of the object he created. Harry hit the man on the head again, then put the object in the bag and said that he would still look at his behavior, and then said that he needed to somehow lure all the saints. Hugo replied that all the constellations would hardly want to leave their residences, to which Harry, putting the chest on the table, said that this should be enough. Hugo exclaimed that it was the royal heirloom of Aries, and the message stated that this heirloom could multiply the number of items stored. The man asked another how he was able to get something that only Victor had access to. Harry replied that since his friend was the saint of the beggar constellation, he had brought the thing as a wallet, to which Hugo irritably replied that his constellation was not called that, and Harry only said that with the help of this box, he will be able to generate new materials in order to create high-ranking relics later. Then Hugo asked how he was going to activate it since no one here could do it. Then Harry asked how that was possible, couldn't he? To which Hugo exclaimed that his constellation was Sagittarius. Harry stared at the table in disappointment. And then, looking at the chest, he said that he had a feeling that they would be able to activate it, to which the other said that nothing would come of it. Suddenly, Harry said that he had already sent an application to the news network. Hugo, thinking he had misheard, asked again, but the man continued to tinker with the box. Then the holy archer cried out, asking whether the man had gone mad. Meanwhile, something was happening in the Blue House in South Korea. Several people gathered at the table, and someone said that they were idiots, that they had disgraced themselves by not being able to deal with even one spider. As it turned out, it was the bishop of the branching constellation of Leo, Oliver, who was sitting with his feet up on the table, and he said that they should have continued to trade talismans. Why were they getting into battles with the attractors? Another man exclaimed that Oliver should refrain from such statements, to which the bishop said that he had heard that the Spider Queen had been killed by an unknown boy, so had Harry himself risen from the grave. But suddenly someone exclaimed that it was enough, and the lamp that was standing on the table broke. As it turned out, it was Simon, who said with a smile on his face that the Lion Bishop must be very excited about Harry's achievements. Oliver said that it wouldn't be hard for Harry to destroy that huge creature, and then he asked if he saw that video from the burning Russia, to which Simon replied that the whole thing was that he was strengthened by other saints, and they even provided him with better weapons. He said that they would have done better in such comfortable conditions, in response to which Oliver laughed and asked if it was really just a matter of conditions. Simon said he wanted to point out that the Spider Queen was ultimately destroyed by the twins branching, at the cost of the life of an S-rank Templar. Oliver noted with irony, it was such a big loss. The men fell silent, their auras glowing brightly around them. The man sat to the side of them, gritting his teeth, and wondered how it had happened that the Blue House had become a hangout for these scumbags. Suddenly, someone burst into the room and told the president to turn on the news immediately. The news said that their news channel literally just received a mysterious package. Inside were photographs of the holy sign of Aries, Victor, and the same short message. Judging by the results of the analysis, the handwriting matches Harry's. Meanwhile, Hugo, who had also found out what Harry had sent, shouted irritably. He asked him what he was thinking, to which Harry answered, sitting on the phone, that it was just an announcement. He was letting them know that soon their heads would be with him too. Hugo shook his head and said that Victor's death was already a huge problem, and he decided to make it even worse. Hearing this, the man threw his head back and said, "Victor is not dead." Hugo asked again, and Harry said that he couldn't even be called alive. These words struck the saint even more. With a happy smile, Harry pulled out a toy rabbit and announced that it was Victor. Hugo backed away in disgust, asking again. While stretching the rabbit's ears, Harry said that his skills had improved, and therefore he was able to trap Victor's astral body in this toy. Hugo asked if that was even possible, but Harry said that it wasn't important, and then he handed him the knife. The man said that this was the same knife that was stabbed into his back. Holding the knife in his hand, the saint thought that this was clearly not an ordinary dagger. Harry began to stretch the rabbit, and Hugo noted that since he was stabbed with this knife, it was definitely not Victor. Then the man asked if he should apologize then. Throwing the rabbit over his shoulder, Harry said that he was going to visit the shopping mall. Hugo asked him why he wanted to do that. The man replied that the pig had told him that he had seen a blade of a similar shape there. Taking the clothes from Hugo, Harry headed for the exit, telling Slave 2 to guard the house. Hugo, holding Victor the rabbit in his hands, asked who the first slave was. Waving his hand, Harry headed out, saying goodbye to the first slave, Hugo. Victor's house was still destroyed. Some people were walking among the debris, looking at it. One woman, addressing the saint, said that, as expected, the constellation Aries is not here, and the aura of the sacred essence is not felt either. The saint, who was playing with the water that was pouring around her finger, asked again. Sophie, the saint of the Aquarius sign, who was lying in the bathtub, asked where he could have disappeared to. The woman replied that perhaps he had taken his property and intentionally disappeared somewhere, to which the saint replied that if he had secretly conducted some transactions with other saints, then everything would become more problematic. Sophie's face took on a serious expression, and her subordinate asked if it was possible that it was the supposedly returned Harry who had kidnapped Victor. Hearing this, the woman laughed loudly. Throwing her head back, she turned to her subordinate with whom she was talking. She said that it was a very stupid joke, and in the meantime, the ball of water bound one of the servants who was nearby. Sophie's subordinate heard someone screaming. She immediately apologized, saying that she had said it without thinking, to which the saint replied that everything was fine. They would visit the shopping mall as planned. They needed to get rid of the unnecessary relics before the auction began. Suddenly, another subordinate burst into Sophie's bathroom screaming that they were in trouble. She said that another saint had decided to take part in the auction, which made the saint turn around sharply. Previously, this same saint was now in the gym. The men who were there looked at someone with admiration. A muscular man stood by the window with his back to the others, and someone approached him from behind and addressed him, calling him Mr. Stephen. He said they had received information that a relic belonging to Harry would be put up for auction. Hearing this, Stephen turned his head to look at the man. He dropped his hands sharply, causing the barbell he was holding to fall to the floor. Stephen smiled and asked if the time had finally come. Turning around, he said that they would take this relic for themselves. As it turned out, it was Stephen, the holy sign of Leo. Meanwhile, somewhere in another part of the city, a portal began to glow with a bright light, and someone came out of it. Harry said that portals were very convenient, and Scott, who was standing next to him, said that they were usually very expensive, but members of the twin branch could use them for free. As it turns out, Harry and Scott have reached the relic trading complex. Harry thanked the guy and said that he really needed an expert, and he volunteered to help him find the SS rank. Scott replied that he was happy to help, and he remembered Simon's words that he should recruit the man at any cost. And then messages from the contact scumbag boss appeared on Scott's phone. Putting his hand on his shoulder, Harry asked if his boss was still pestering him, even despite the incident at the hypermarket. And then the man returned the knife in the boy's sheath, saying that it had really helped him in the battle with the bugs. Scott, taking the rod in his hands, said that it seemed to him that the blade had broken after that battle, to which the man replied that he had completely restored it, but its effectiveness would change slightly. Hearing this, Scott put the knife in his chest and thanked the man, who noticed that they had already arrived. Standing in front of the entrance to the building, he asked if there was an SS rank appraiser here. After some time, a man walking through the shopping area noticed something. Blushing, he asked what such a man was doing here. The man standing next to him also blushed. As it turned out, they all paid attention to the saint of the sign of Aquarius. She said she wanted to get rid of some relics before the auction, to which the worker apologized in a panic and said that the appraiser was currently busy with another client. The woman replied that everything was fine and she would wait, but she herself thought irritably about how they dared serve anyone else when she was here. Standing in front of the entrance with her retinue, she wondered who was inside. Standing at the display case, Harry said that the prices for the items here were worthy of SS rank. The appraiser, holding a figurine in his hands, asked Scott who made it, to which Harry immediately responded, Virgo Branching Evaluator. Jean asked the man if there was any possibility that he was related to Harry. Scott replied that the man was his impersonator, and the appraiser asked the guy to step outside, saying that he needed to ask the client a few questions. Scott muttered something irritably but still left, and then Jean asked the man about how exactly he was connected to Harry, in response to which he asked why he was asking. The appraiser said that many people don't know this, but Harry is famous not only for his fighting skills but also for his skillful abilities. And the relic that he brought him is often counterfeited, but his instinct tells him that Harry himself had a hand in it. In response to this, Harry asked about the fact that the man was apparently well-informed, to which Jean replied that of course he was. And then he, blushing and looking away, said that he was his favorite student. These words discouraged the man, and he asked again. He folded his arms across his chest and thought that he didn't remember having any students. The appraiser, continuing to examine the statuette, said that, given its age, it was unlikely that he had trained it. But this work was truly amazing. He almost believed in its authenticity. An annoyed Harry wondered whether he should sue him as a fraud. Jean handed the man a notebook and said that he had received the item when he was Harry's apprentice. Looking at the notebook, the man thought that this was the same notebook that he had once lost. Could this appraiser be that annoying newcomer who followed him around in China? He was so ingrained in his memory that he even missed him a little. And Jean said that Harry was truly a man with a fine sense of beauty. The man cried out that one day he suddenly disappeared, leaving this in his home. Hearing this, Harry thought he lost the notebook, but it seemed that this guy stole it. The appraiser began to leaf through the pages, saying that he couldn't make out the handwriting, but was sure that there were many brilliant ideas hidden there, and Harry thought that this was just a list of his victims. He thought that after he woke up, every time he got information with what he fought, but it seemed like this guy would be able to get more information. Jin handed the notebook to the man, saying that it should serve the young talent. Harry accepted it with joy, as it contained his very first sketches. There have been reports that the notebook's dormant magic is reacting to its owner's aura, and under the influence of Ophiuchus's magical power, the notebook has been transformed into a relic. Noticing this, Jean cried out that this was a relic of the memory type. It seemed that Harry had put a charm on it when he was still alive. But then someone shouted, telling Jin that they were in trouble, and the man turned around. He asked what was the matter, to which the worker answered, pointing to the door, that a saint was waiting outside. Jean muttered irritably that they were making such a fuss over a trifle, and Harry asked again. Meanwhile, Sophie was still standing on the street. She thought about how these worthless people dared to stare at her. And every time the same thing. Scott, standing in the crowd and drinking something from a straw, thought that he thought Sophie was too picky for such outings. Sophie said that they had been waiting too long already, so she thought she should go in personally and hurry them up. And she was thinking that the damn appraiser should buy their relics at a good price, so that they would have enough money for the auction. But he was making them wait too long. Sophie hurried to the door, but the worker grabbed her by the shoulder and stopped her, saying again that there was still a client inside. But this only made the woman even more angry, and she wanted to know because of whom she was being treated, but why she was not being treated. And then she went inside anyway. Looking at Harry, who was standing in front, she opened her mouth wide. In front of her, she saw an unimaginable handsome man with whom it would not be a sin to fall in love. She reached out her hand, thinking she wanted to look a little closer. But before she could get any closer, a huge snake appeared before her eyes and opened its mouth at her. The woman froze in fear and opened her eyes wide. And then her legs weakened, and she sank to the floor, and her retinue immediately asked what was wrong with her. She, in a panic, wondered what she had just felt. She felt as if hundreds of poisonous snakes were wrapping around her entire body. The thought that she needed to run immediately sounded loudly in her head, and she abruptly took off. Jean asked why she ran away so abruptly, to which Harry replied that she probably felt sick. A message appeared that a subordinate of the sacred essence dared to approach the serpent bearer. The opponent's divinity has passed to the serpent bearer. The current indicator is 35%. Divinity is a sacred power needed to support the power of a holy entity. You can steal divinity from followers of other branches. If it falls to 0, the sacred throne will begin to lose its power, and its owner will become vulnerable. Harry asked Jean if the girl who came in recently was really a saint, to which the appraiser replied that it was Sophie, the holy sign of Aquarius, which greatly surprised the man. And then Harry laughed out loud because she turned out to be this saint. He thought that she had changed so much that he didn't even recognize her yet. She had certainly become prettier, but her rotten soul remained. If you categorize the things he despised, which included fish bones, vermin, and sewage, Sophie would be a vermin he didn't even consider human. Jean said that he didn't understand why they called her a saint, because she actually had a very selfish nature, to which Harry again noted that he was well aware. Jean said that Sophie once tried to take over Harry's property by claiming that she had provided him with healing help, but she failed and the matter was passed on to the government. The appraiser noticed that the woman almost called the man by name. Did they really know each other? Harry replied that they were old friends. Meanwhile, Sophie ran off somewhere into a quiet alley. She leaned her hand on the wall and leaned forward, her subordinate running after her. Sophie thought that for some reason she remembered Harry's face. She asked her subordinate if she had ever been so scared that death seemed like a more enticing option. Afterwards, she ordered her to go back to the pawnshop and find out who the man was. Then her subordinate asked what to do with the appraiser. After a short silence, she wanted to say something but suddenly stopped short. And then she said with a smile that she had changed her mind. Turning around with wild eyes, she told her to just kill them. Her subordinate replied that he was from the branch of the Virgin and they needed to sell him relics, to which the saint replied that she could kill him under the pretext that he had insulted and another had embarrassed her. Taking off the pendant from her neck, she said that she would even give her a relic and lend her a piece of the sacred essence's power. The woman objected, saying that magic was forbidden to use in a peaceful zone. Without showing any open aggression, Sophie asked her if she dared to refuse to carry out her orders. The woman immediately looked away and said that the wish of a saint is the wish of a sacred entity, and then she knelt down to accept the pendant. After accepting the pendant, she continued by saying that the desire of a heavenly being is the desire of heaven itself, and therefore she cannot resist the order of one of the 12 saints who support the whole world. After some time, Harry, who was still with the appraiser, noticed that water was dripping from the ceiling. Meanwhile, something was happening in the relic trading complex, the central area. Scott walked the streets, sipping from a glass. Suddenly, his gaze caught on something on the ground. There was a puddle under his feet, although it was not raining. The guy leaned closer to the water, thinking that he felt the slightest bit of magical energy emanating from it. And suddenly a hand of some creature appeared from the puddle. In surprise, Scott let go of his hand and his glass fell to the ground. Meanwhile, a water creature that looked like a guy was crawling out of the puddle. Scott stepped back, wondering what the hell was going on. But suddenly he heard a loud sound and turned around sharply. As it turned out, this situation happened not only to him. Sophie stood on the roof watching this and she laughed quietly. She waved her hand, summoning a duplicate mirror. With a soft smile on her face, she said that the creatures were of the same strength as the A-rank Templars, but they would not be able to cope with such an army. Scott turned to his subordinate Sophie, who was walking down the street. He yelled, asking why she was using skills in a peaceful area, and then he told her to stop it. The woman turned around and said that it was the Saint's order, so there was nothing to worry about. She said that everything they do by the will of the gods. And then she activated the relic that was in her hands, and the cup glowed brightly. Scott lunged forward to snatch the cup from her hands. But he didn't have time to do this, and a huge column of light flew into the air. A huge number of water balloons appeared in the air, which trapped the people who were in the square. The woman ordered the water creatures to seize the appraiser, and she would deal with him herself. And the creatures, obeying her command, turned into water and quickly ran away. Scott also found himself trapped in a water sphere. He thought that he needed to get out before he passed out. A small flame appeared on his palm. The guy thought that he needed to get out at any cost, but soon his eyes began to close. Meanwhile, water was collecting on the pawn shop's ceiling. Jin noticed that he felt strange currents of magic, and at that very moment water tentacles appeared and grabbed the man. Suddenly, someone pointed a blade at Harry's neck, and Sophie's subordinate ordered the man not to move. She said that there was nothing personal here, but he dared to offend the saint. She told him to behave without stupidity if he did not want bloodshed. The appraiser was bound with water tentacles, and the woman said that the saint had ordered her to kill them both. But if they apologized, and their relics were bought at a high price, then perhaps they would be forgiven. Jin didn't answer but just looked away, frowning. But then Harry said that people weren't allowed to brandish knives in public places, causing the man to look up in surprise. Harry, saying he had no intention of using a weapon, took the knife blade between two fingers and broke it. And then he told the appraiser not to forget to ask them to compensate for the damage caused. The appraiser looked at the man, thinking that he had managed to destroy the gift of the Aquarius constellation with his bare hands. This angered the woman, and she exclaimed that she had told him not to move. And then the water tentacles released Jin to rush towards Harry, but the man merely waved his fist, and the water immediately dispersed away from him. Turning to the woman, he asked her if she had any more. The sensations were simply amazing. She put her hand in her jacket pocket and thought about how the man had easily destroyed the A-class avatar. She knew that the saint had gotten sick for a reason. Looking at him, she thought that he was dangerous. She needed to deal with him as quickly as possible. She pulled out the pendant that the saint had given her and exclaimed that he would do nothing against it. Streams of water burst from the pendant and landed on the floor, and the woman exclaimed that they were created by the saint herself. And she summoned orange-class creatures, water wolves. Looking at the wolves, Harry said with a smile that these pests were glad to see him. Turning his back to the appraiser, he suddenly called him by name, and then he said that he would borrow these blades from him, since he had told him to take whatever he wanted. And suddenly, he jumped up. Harry ran straight towards the wolves with a sharp movement. With sharp movements of his hands, he began to chop down the wolves, and he noted that these daggers were very good. As he continued to chop down the wolves, he exclaimed that these wolves were no stronger than yard dogs, probably because the weapon was above A rank. A message appeared that the information had been collected, a fragment of a duplicate mirror, but the man continued to hack at his opponents. There have been numerous reports of new skills and buffs being added. Sophie's subordinate froze uncertainly, not believing how easily the saint's calls were destroyed. But then the man turned to her, and her eyes widened in fear. Turning to her, he told her that they were not finished yet. The image of a snake immediately appeared in the woman's mind. Her body shook slightly when she thought that the man was on a completely different level, and if she tried to attack him, she would die immediately. Then she quickly ran through the open doors, shouting that this was not the end. Harry chuckled and replied that the idiots who shouted that it wasn't the end were the most pathetic. Jean stared at Harry, and then suddenly someone called out to the man with concern. As it turned out, it was Scott, who exclaimed that he had been attacked by a Templar from the Aquarius branch and had barely escaped. And immediately he saw a view of many bodies of wolves lying motionless on the floor, and he asked what had happened here. Scott asked if these weren't calls from the saint, to which Harry replied that they were, but by sending such gifts they only gave him more resources. The guy said that they should leave anyway before the next attack, but suddenly someone called out to them, asking them to wait. Jean thought about how 20 years ago he followed Harry everywhere, and therefore he remembered very well how he collected materials after each battle with monsters. He noted that this fighting style was as if the demon himself was fighting. Could it be that he was Harry? But the man didn't answer, but only raised his finger to his lips, and then he smiled meaningfully, looking at the man. Jin, noticing this, smiled, and his eyes filled with tears. As he headed out, Harry said that he would be back for the materials, so he asked to keep an eye on them, and besides, he still had some questions. In response to this, the appraiser bowed respectfully, loudly saying goodbye to the man, and he and the guy had already left the building. Scott asked the man why the saint had attacked him, whether he had offended her in any way, to which he responded by telling the guy to wait a little. The man frowned, but there was a smirk on his lips, his eyes shining brightly as he said that he would soon see something funny. After some time, they reached a cafe in the area. There were many different sweets and ice creams on their table, and Harry ate it all with pleasure. The man exclaimed that the ice cream here was just superb, and he told him to eat as much as his heart desired. Scott responded hesitantly that it might be too expensive, to which Harry replied that it was okay because he had picked up the thing that had fallen out of that woman's pocket, and it seemed to come with many privileges. He said that it was called an emblem, and that it was similar in functionality to a bank card. But with it, he could even rent other people's skills. Scott, leaning closer, noted that he hadn't even noticed that it had the Aquarius emblem on it, and he thought that they might have a problem, since it also served as an ID. But Harry just continued eating the sweets, telling the guy not to worry and that they would think about it later. But then Simon came up behind them and told Scott that he didn't think he liked the ice cream there either. The guy turned around in surprise, and Harry decided to tear his gaze away from his plate. Simon came closer and asked them if they minded if he joined them. Harry looked sternly at the man, continuing to eat his ice cream, and thought that this was probably the same boss who had been bothering the guy. Simon sat down on the empty chair and introduced himself to Harry, saying that he was the bishop of the twin branch, and then he asked if Scott had told him anything about him. But the man seemed more interested in the ice cream. Looking at the man, Simon said that Scott said that he met a mysterious man who managed to defeat the Spider Queen when Victor failed. Harry asked, munching on his ice cream, "What business did the man have?" The man replied that recruiting promising awakened people was one of the bishop's main tasks. Harry asked what he could offer him then if he wanted to hire him. Simon said that the upcoming big auction would be for one of Harry's 8 legendary heirlooms, and then he asked why they didn't continue their conversation while enjoying the auction process. Hearing this, Harry put his spoon down on the table, and then he smiled while the ice cream was smeared across his lips, and he said that the man knew how to intrigue. He asked how far the auction house was from here. Simon, holding out his hand, said that it was not far at all, and since the lots would be such rare relics, it was decided to hold the raffle in an appropriate place. He said that this place is located at an altitude of 16,000 feet above the earth, where the largest auction house is located. He said that this place is the floating city of Drachma. Meanwhile, something was happening in the large auction house of Drachma. Still suspended, Sophie sat there in the chair by the window, her hands clutched to her chest as ragged breaths escaped her. Her whole body was shaking, and her gaze darted around the room. But then someone called her, and he put a glass of ice on the armrest. Stephen told the woman to get lost if she planned to cower in the corner and shiver, and he raised his hand to take a sip of alcohol. Sophie shot him an irritated look, and she thought that he was still a stupid, uncouth lout. But today, she had to control herself. She thought that this was the strongest person who even managed to surpass Harry, and therefore there was no place safer than next to him. Getting up from his chair, the man said that in any case, Harry's relic would become his, so there was no point in her even claiming it. The man walked towards the exit when Sophie asked him where he was going, to which he replied that it was none of her business. Stephen walked out of the room, and the woman remained sitting in the chair and did not answer him. She sighed as she looked out the window and told herself that she just needed to calm down. She thought about the fact that this was Drachma after all, so whoever that person was, they wouldn't be able to get in here. But then her gaze caught on something outside the window. As it turned out, she noticed Hugo, who was also in the floating castle. She thought with a smile that the desired guest had appeared at the perfect time. Hugo, as it turned out, was wandering around the palace looking for Harry, not understanding where he had disappeared to. He thought that, knowing his character, he was sure that he would come here because the city of Drachma was a real treasure trove of precious relics, and in the meantime, someone was sneaking up on him from behind. Sophie tapped the man on the shoulder, saying that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. She tilted her head to the side and asked how he was doing, her face hidden by the hood. Hugo turned to look at the woman and he noticed with irritation that it was Sophie. She crossed her arms over her chest and said that she still couldn't get through to him. Propping her chin on her hand, she said with a grin that it seemed time spares no one. Because he used to be such a handsome man, his face had changed a lot. Leaning forward, she asked if it could be because he had few followers. But Hugo just told her to fuck off, as he didn't want to talk to her at all. But this didn't upset the woman at all, although she asked if he was really going to ignore her again. And then she said that at this rate, his son could suffer the same fate as his wife. Sophie looked at his back with a smile, and she asked if his wife was still alive. And then she herself answered that her condition was indistinguishable from death, and that this shame had been brought upon his house by none other than the head of the family. Hearing this, Hugo looked at her furiously, his eyes and hair lighting up like fire, and suddenly an explosion thundered in the room. The man stood in front of the woman, and the wall behind her was completely destroyed. Hugo said in a menacing voice that he told her to get lost. Sophie, in response to these, simply raised her hand to her face to hide her smile. And then she dispersed, with her other hand pushing the man's hand aside. And she said that he, like a good boy, managed to restrain himself, and she had already thought that he had forgotten about the contract that they had all signed 10 years ago. And then her serious gaze darted to Hugo, and drops of water flew around her face. A water ball appeared in one of her hands, and she raised her other hand, causing a vortex of water to swirl from above as she said that she should teach the arrogant boy a lesson. But then someone shouted at her from behind, which made her turn around. And when she turned around, she immediately felt a flick of fingers on her forehead. The woman's eyes rolled back, her forehead turned red, and she began to fall to the floor. Unconscious, Sophie fell heavily to the floor as Harry watched. Hugo quickly turned around, his mouth wide open in surprise. Harry noticed with surprise that Hugo was there too, and he asked him what he had forgotten there, to which the saint answered that he was worried about him, and he himself was thinking that he could not take his eyes off him. Harry asked again, and then he asked if he really had a crush on him, to which Hugo told him not to talk nonsense. And then Harry looked at Sophie lying on the floor and he asked with disgust why he kept bumping into her, and the man wondered if she had fallen in love with him too. And Hugo thought that his friend really had problems with his head. Meanwhile, Sophie was thinking about Harry, the 13th constellation, recognized as the strongest. She always disliked him and rather feared him. After all, his face was covered with disgusting scars. He had a cruel disposition that spared no one who stood in his way. And that arrogant look. One day, 20 years ago, there was a severe thunderstorm outside. Harry, in a hospital gown with a broken arm, burst into some castle and the servants began to stop him. One of the maids stood in his way, spreading her arms wide, and she said that he was in the residence of Aquarius, and then she asked him to leave this place. But Harry just looked at her sternly and ordered her to get lost. The maid ran away in panic when someone asked him what she should understand by this. It turned out it was Sophie, and she asked how he dared to break into her house. But before she could say anything else, the man slammed his fist into the wall next to her, causing her to scream in fear. Leaning closer to the woman, Harry asked if she really wanted to die. Sophie asked him what he was doing, to which the man replied that he had sent her to the rear to help heal people. So why the hell was she loafing around here? He grabbed her hand and exclaimed that many had lost their arms and legs because they tried to save her worthless life. Harry walked forward, pulling her along with him, and he said that she herself said that she intended to help people as soon as she arrived. So let her go and keep her promise. Sophie cried out, asking what difference it made if a couple more people died, and they, on the contrary, should be happy that they had the chance to save her. She screamed that she had skin problems because of it, and she was not going to go there for some stupid choirs. Hearing this, Harry stopped and turned to look at her. Sophie turned away from the man, covering her nose, and she told him to get lost now that he finally understood. And then she jerked her hand to get rid of his grip. She pulled her hand back in disgust, asking him why he had squeezed it so hard. But the next moment, Harry swung his hand and hit the woman on the cheek, and he cried out loudly that it seemed like he would only achieve something when he beat all this nonsense out of her. And in the end, Sophie was forced to treat everyone until they lost consciousness. But then she heard a voice asking her how much longer she was going to sleep. Hearing him, she woke up and looked at the man. Sophie found herself tied to a chair, and she stared in shock at Harry, who was sitting opposite her. And then her loud, piercing scream was heard throughout the entire castle. And then she cried out that they should untie her immediately. How dare they treat a saint like that? Harry noted that she hadn't changed at all in 20 years, to which Hugo sighed wearily. Sophie thought that they wouldn't get away with it that easily, because she was no longer the same girl she had been before. She thought that it would not be difficult for her to melt this rope, and her hands glowed with a blue light. A sphere of water appeared behind her, and she thought with a smirk that she couldn't be held back by something like that. But suddenly her thoughts were interrupted by another click on the forehead. Harry stood up from his chair and told her that it was written all over her face. But then he noticed that his fingers were smoking, and he asked what it was. Sophie screamed that she had an acidic layer placed on her that protected her from all external attacks. So now all this acid will spread throughout his body and eat him away from the inside. But then Harry showed her his middle finger, which was already fine, saying that the wound had already disappeared. Noticing this, Sophie's mouth opened wide, noticing that the melted tissues instantly reformed. The man said with a smile that it was time for them to go back to everything that had happened between them. He said that he heard her lying to everyone, taking credit for his recovery after the battles. For that she deserves a blow. And it was she who sent her subordinate to the assessor. For that another 5 blows. And she also said all sorts of bad things to Hugo. For that another 50 blows. But then Sophie cried out, asking him to wait. And the man asked again with his hand frozen in the air. And then he just stared at her silently. And a second later he moved his hand forward, thinking that he had waited. And Harry began to hit Sophie while Hugo calmly sipped his tea. He glanced at them out of the corner of his eye and thought that Harry was really good at beating the crap out of people. But then he felt something strange, as if Harry's divinity was growing with each blow. And, as it turned out, Hugo was not mistaken, and many reports appeared around the man about his increased divinity. After a while, Harry stopped because he noticed that Sophie's head was hanging, and he noted that the woman passed out. There have been reports that divinity has been unlocked, the current level is 50% and requires recharging. Noticing this, Harry asked to be reminded of what divinity was. There have been reports that divinity is the power of the sacred essence needed to maintain the energy of the saint. Divinity can be opened in followers of entities other than his. If it falls to 0, then the sacred throne will lose all power. Such a flight outcome will lead to death. Harry thought about how by kicking saints' asses he was taking away their divinity, and then he realized that he hadn't beaten it out of Victor because he couldn't do it yet. Harry thought with a smile that he needed to become stronger anyway. At this point, Hugo asked the man if he had thought it would be worth questioning Sophie about the dagger. Harry replied that the woman would not have the courage to attack them, and he had found someone who could look at the dagger, and Hugo thought that he was mocking her just for fun. At this point, Harry grabbed something in his trouser pocket. Taking his phone out of his pocket, he noticed that it had already been that long. Hugo asked him where he got the smartphone, to which the man replied that he borrowed it from a guy. Smiling at Hugo, he told him that it was time for him to run, so he should clean up here, and he could throw Sophie in the trash. Harry ran into the elevator, saying that he would call him after the auction. Hugo sighed tiredly and turned to look at the unconscious Sophie. But then the elevator door swung open again, deciding that it was Harry who had returned for something. Hugo turned to him and asked if he had forgotten anything. But it wasn't Harry, and the man thought that out of all the people here, it was he. As it turned out, it was Stephen. Stephen's gaze dropped to Sophie, who was still tied to the chair, her head hanging to her chest. And then he looked up at Hugo. The man called out threateningly to the other, sparks flying around his body, and he advised him to explain himself. But after, having calmed down a little, he reached out to take off his glasses and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. And then he noticed with a grin that the archer was not happy about their meeting. Hugo asked him what he was doing there, to which Stephen replied that he and Aquarius had made a deal. She asked him to be her bodyguard. He still had business in Drachma, so he agreed. Stephen asked Hugo why he was there, to which he replied that he had my business too. The man asked him if he was targeting Harry's relics. Then Hugo asked if they were being auctioned off today. Stephen grinned and replied that he, like a pathetic constellation, would never have been able to afford them anyway. In response to this, Hugo chuckled and asked the man if he was really going around picking up Harry's relics. He said that he had tried to ignore him for a long time because of his growing inferiority complex, and had even gone so far as to start picking up all of his relics. Hugo asked Stephen if he really thought he could become as strong as him. Stephen's nostrils flared in response, and suddenly there was an explosion around him. There were also flashes around Hugo's body, and he thought that the man had gone mad at the mention of Harry, as he had expected. Stephen pulled his hand back to strike the man, his hand shining like a bright flash, and then he grabbed Hugo by the wrist. He squeezed his hand so hard that even the veins stood out. He told him to stop talking nonsense, his eyes flashing with an evil light. and he told him to stop talking nonsense about this weakling. He jerked his hand sharply, breaking Hugo's wrist, and he sternly told him not to dare speak Harry's name in his presence again. His eyes flashed furiously as he said that he had been stronger than him for a long time. But then someone ran out of the elevator, calling out to Stephen, saying that they had problems. The man yelled about the twins branching out and buying up all of Harry's memorabilia, causing Stephen to turn around sharply. He turned back to Hugo and said he didn't have time to mess with him, and he slapped his hand away with a sharp movement. Stephen headed for the exit, telling Hugo to do whatever he wanted with Sophie, to which Hugo exclaimed, "Didn't he come here to save her?" The man replied that the relics were much more important. He needed to get there as quickly as possible. Turning around, he told the archer to choose his words more carefully in the future if he wanted to live longer. Hearing this, Hugo grinned and thanked the man for the advice. And then Stephen left the room, the elevator doors slammed shut. Sophie was still unconscious. The grin fell from Hugo's face and he cursed under his breath. Looking at his injured hand, he thought that the man didn't even consider him a weakling. Meanwhile, the auction was in full swing, and the twin branch made a bid again. The presenter cried out that the lot was once again being taken over by the twins branching. She announced that the first stage of the auction had come to an end, and the second stage would begin immediately after a short break. Harry, who had a number of bottles of alcohol on the table in front of him, happily exclaimed that he had got another lot. Simon, who was sitting in the chair next to him, congratulated the man and said that he could buy himself whatever he wanted. Harry scratched his head and said that the man was too kind because he invited him to the VIP room and bought him everything he asked for. Simon adjusted his glasses and replied that it was the least he could do, and Scott asked him if he was sure, since they had already spent an obscene amount of money. Looking at the guy, the man replied that everything was fine, and then he asked him if he could pay for the alcohol since he had forgotten his card. Scott agreed, but he thought that he had already spent a lot today, but he couldn't object to his boss. But then Harry, holding the card between his two fingers, replied that everything had already been paid for. Noticing the card in the man's hands, Simon checked his pockets and realized it was his card, and he then wondered how he had managed it. Waving the card, Harry said that Simon looked pretty drunk, so he paid in advance. He couldn't make his subordinate pay, could he? In response to this, the bishop replied that he was just about to pay with his card, and he himself thought that the man was still so young and already so rude. Still, he's a damn genius for defeating the Spider Queen, and if he can recruit him, it'll all be a small price to pay. Leaning forward, he said that since they were a little relaxed, they should get to the main topic, and some kind of pink gas appeared in the air. Simon began to talk about how he had high hopes for the man's future, and he thought he had a chance to become an S rank or even higher. Harry didn't listen to him, but thought about the fact that this fog that covered the mind control was practically invisible to anyone, and although the effect was not so strong, it made him trust this idiot more. Simon continued, saying that he could even make him a cardinal. He promised him untold riches, and he also promised him great glory. But, among other things, he promised him the respect of the great leader of the twins. An inspired Simon extended his hand to Harry, offering him the chance to be reborn as a follower of the twins constellation. But in response to this, Harry only laughed loudly. After stopping laughing, the man remarked that he had been laughing too much lately, and then he asked the bishop if this was really what he wanted. Does he really want him to become another one of his worthless god's lackeys? Simon was taken aback by this change of mood and decided that he needed to change the subject as soon as possible, and he said that there had been a misunderstanding. Then someone knocked on the door and announced that the one relic had arrived, and the man turned around happily. And he immediately told the woman to come in, and she opened the door, going inside. Approaching Harry, she handed him the relic on a tray, saying that all the certificates were ready. But then Simon asked in surprise if he had really won Harry's relic. Taking up a gold pendant on a wide chain, Harry replied that he himself had told him to choose anything, even if it was not exactly what he was looking for. Remembering Stephen's obsession, the man nervously ran up to Harry, saying that this relic already had an owner. And at that very moment, a loud explosion broke the door to the room. Everyone present stared at this. As it turned out, it was Stephen. The man angrily asked who dared to touch his relics. Harry turned around and asked if it was Stephen who had laid claim to the relic. Simon hastened to calm Stephen down, saying that their newcomer had made a mistake, but they would immediately return the relic. Stephen folded his arms and replied that he would turn a blind eye to it then. Simon thanked him and quickly agreed to this, and he said that they could pay later. But then the man said that it was thanks to them, because he had not spent a penny on the relic. Simon asked again, to which Stephen chuckled. Grabbing the man's head with one hand, he asked irritably if they really thought they could touch his things with impunity. The bishop stood motionless, thinking that because of this small oversight he wanted to leave them without tens of millions of dollars. But then Harry intervened in the conversation, asking what they were talking about. The man happily said that he had won the auction, so the relic was now his, and if he wanted to take it, he should pay him $200 million. Hearing this, Stephen froze silently, and then he laughed loudly, saying that it seemed that among the twins' branches there were not only cowards, and Simon looked at Harry with a face full of horror. Stephen pushed the bishop away and walked forward, saying that he liked the man. That's what a real man should be like. Coming closer, he asked him why they didn't introduce themselves to each other. Stephen extended his hand to Harry, lightning swirling around him, and he said that he always greeted new acquaintances very warmly. Harry asked him what he was talking about, and he thought that the guy had managed to increase his strength slightly. This is to be expected from the constellation Leo, which specializes in battles. Looking at the man, he thought that he would not calm down until he destroyed someone. Stephen, meanwhile, reached out to the man as if she was about to pounce on a snake. The saint placed his hand on Harry's shoulder, and everything around him lit up with bright flashes. Concerned, Scott called out to Harry. Simon swore quietly and thought that he had indeed provoked him. With a grin on his face, Stephen said he was glad to meet him and hoped the man enjoyed his life in a wheelchair. But then Harry, whose t-shirt was burned under the man's hand, asked him what he was doing. He asked if he was trying to brush dust off his shoulder. Noticing that the man was fine, the saint froze in shock, thinking that the blow had hit the target. He asked him if he had dodged it with teleportation, to which Harry, pushing his hand away, said that he was still as slow-witted as ever. Smiling, he asked the saint if he really thought that the crushing cliff blow that he himself had come up with would work on him. Harry said that the man had sworn to him that he would use this skill for the good of people, but now he used it to boast about his power. Hearing this, Stephen asked the man who he was, and fear spread through his body. But then the auction host exclaimed that the auction would soon be reopened for bids. Stephen was surprised to note that it was already time for the second stage, but Harry was not enthusiastic about it. Stephen pointed his finger at the man and said that he had a lot of questions, but right now there were more important things to do. The saint headed towards the exit, telling him to keep the pendant since he would come back for it. Scott ran up to Harry and asked him if he was okay. Simon thought that even he couldn't dodge the saint's skills. He wondered who this guy really was. The host said that they would start the second stage with the highlight of the auction. She asked if they knew about the Berlin Wolf incident that happened 24 years ago, which was a mystical case of the appearance of a bad luck figure on German territory. It was a real hell, in which even armor and weapons melted. The 12 saints were unable to find a solution, and all their raids ended in failure. But then Harry came along and managed to defeat that invincible monster, and today they had the chance to become the owner of that very relic with which Harry put an end to the monster's existence. Stephen, who had already reached the auction hall, thought that this weapon would finally be his, and he remembered what happened those same 20 years ago. A helicopter was flying over the island. The reporter sitting in it was talking on camera about how right now they were above the island where the Berlin Wolf had appeared. It's been 4 days since Harry, the 13th to awaken, arrived, and no one has come out since then. The situation remains unknown. In order to find out what was happening, several saints tried to enter inside, but were unable to do so due to the overwhelming energy of the island. Stephen was sitting on a stump when a subordinate approached him, saying that they were already at their limit. The man folded his arms, wondering how Harry could have gotten in there when they couldn't even get close. Why does he feel jealous of a guy who wasn't even chosen by the gods? What's the difference between them? He was still wondering what he was missing when his subordinate exclaimed that Harry had appeared at the exit. Stephen looked up, taken aback. Reporters also noticed Harry coming out. The man, not at all wounded, came out of the forest, and in his hands he had a weapon made of bone. Reporters called this moment the return of a hero. Stephen's subordinate said that once again all the honors went to Harry, and the saint, rising to his feet, said that he finally understood. Walking forward a little, he told his subordinate to tell everyone that they were returning. Moving on, Stephen threw away his weapon and the subordinate asked him if he would take it back, to which he replied that he no longer needed it. He said he found something better. Stephen smiled widely, thinking that he had finally found what he had been missing. Meanwhile, the auction host announced that the weapon that was used to defeat the Berlin Wolf would be up for grabs today. Scott and Simon moved closer to the glass. This announcement also surprised Harry. Stephen, meanwhile, was eagerly awaiting the start of the auction, thinking that he would finally get his hands on it. The bone weapons were revealed to all the guests, and Stephen thought that he would finally have Harry's relic, which would make him truly the strongest. Meanwhile, something was happening outside the auction hall and the castle. As it turned out, there was a white dragon sitting on the roof of one of the towers. His eyes turned red as he noticed he could feel her, and he felt Harry's relic, its power. The presenter abruptly folded the cloth that covered the relic and announced that it was the bone of a demonic beast. Exclamations of admiration and surprise began to echo throughout the hall. The presenter asked who would become the owner of this most powerful relic with historical and practical value. Scott and Simon were upset that this relic was put up for auction and that it would go to the Leo constellation, but Harry came closer. He thought about what he had been thinking about all along. But for it to... Harry turned to Scott, but he cried out that now was not the best time. The boy and the bishop began to press themselves against the glass, desperately wanting this relic to be theirs. The presenter announced the starting bid at $1 million. Immediately there was a noise. People began to actively raise the stakes. Harry was faced with numerous reports that his fame had increased. He asked why everyone was suddenly so alarmed, to which Scott irritably shouted that it was a legendary weapon created by Harry. Turning back to the window, the guy noticed that such a reaction from people was quite expected, but Harry remained irritated and silent. Scott said that no matter what Harry created, it was always of the highest quality, and that's why everyone wants to get their hands on them. He said that this is especially true for the constellation of Leo. Stephen. He is ready to go to the ends of the earth to get them. His incredible power and influence allow him to go as far as he wants. The guy was irritated by the fact that another great creation would become part of the man's collection. All the profits would go to Harry's account, which now belonged to the government, so they could only accept it. Harry heard that all the money would be transferred to his account, and so he sat back, watching with interest as the stakes grew higher and higher. But then Stephen shouted out his billion-dollar bet. As he walked down the stairs, he asked if everyone had heard. He chuckled and repeated that he was buying it for $1 billion, and then he asked if he should raise the bid to $10 billion. The presenter was slightly confused, but still announced the bet at $1 billion. Surprised exclamations were heard in the hall, and some simply sat in the hall thoughtfully. Scott pleaded with Simon to do something, but he replied that he couldn't do anything, and the presenter continued to count down. Even Harry was surprised by such a bet, and he almost choked on his popcorn. The presenter slammed milk on the table as she announced that the item had sold for $1 billion. Meanwhile, the cleaners were walking down the corridor. One of them asked another if he had heard that something had been sold for $1 million, to which the second replied that he was interested in who that crazy guy was. The man said that they shouldn't even dream about such sums, and he really wants something to finally change. But then they noticed something to the side and looked there at the same time. As it turned out, what they noticed was a huge dragon figure outside the window, and the cleaner said he took his words back. Meanwhile, Stephen ran up to his purchase and joyfully held it up when the presenter announced that Stephen was becoming the new owner. The hall exploded with applause and joyful shouts, all the people shouting Stephen's name. But suddenly, something interrupted the joyful cries. Something broke through the wall. Stephen looked up at the shaking ceiling and exclaimed, asking what was going on. Meanwhile, a figure of a dragon appeared in a hole in the wall, and the people who were sitting in the hall ran away in fear. But the dragon said that he had found a relic. Looking at Stephen, the dragon told him to give him the relic. And then the monster opened its mouth wide, from which a loud roar erupted. Following this roar, the dragon rushed forward to take the relic from the man. But Stephen only bared his teeth in response, his eyes shining with a bright light. He swung his purchase, shattering the glass case it was in and sending the dragon's carcass flying backwards. The blow was so strong that the dragon's body bounced off the wall, flew out into the street, and hit the tower there. Following this, something suddenly fell to the ground, and Stephen exclaimed that he had never been so glad to see the puller. Placing his relic on the ground, he said it was a great opportunity to try out his new toy. But then it turned out that the tower into which the dragon flew could not withstand such a blow, and its upper part began to fall down. Scott noticed that the magical bath in the teleportation log had been destroyed. Meanwhile, the people who were near the tower also noticed that it began to break off. Turning around, one of the girls cried out that if the tower fell down, the island would not withstand it. Following this, some old man shouted that they needed to stop the tower with all their might. Hearing this, several more men approached them and offered to help. The people folded their arms across their chests and a bright light emanated from their bodies as they closed their eyes, reciting the spell. Everyone began to chant, hoping to put at least a little power into the overall spell. The girl screamed with her hands up, and a glowing ball appeared above her head, which was formed from the glow of all the people. The others also raised their hands and the light went up in a bright stream. All this light merged into one huge pillar of light that went towards the tower. One of the men threw his hands forward and shouted that the tower was too heavy, and they would not be able to destroy it. The pillar of light disappeared, and the fragments of the tower flew straight at the people. But before the tower fragments had time to fall to the ground, they were engulfed in a bright flame. The man noticed that the tower had burned down in the blink of an eye, and everyone stared at their savior. And their savior turned out to be the holy sign of Sagittarius, Hugo. Towering over the crowd, Hugo waved at the people who greeted him joyfully, while he thought about how this idiot still hadn't learned to control his powers. But then an explosion thundered from the side of the man, causing his eyes to widen in surprise. Turning around, he noticed that there was some kind of creature standing on the ground in that place. This creature had no skin. Only its bones and muscles were visible. Something dark flowed from its mouth, and its eyes glowed red. Gritting his teeth, Hugo discovered that there had been two monsters all along. Something dark flowed from the monster's mouth even more intensely, causing a puddle to form next to him. And then this puddle, as if it were alive, split and rushed towards the people who were nearby. The dark substance landed directly on the face of one of the men, covering his mouth and nose. The same thing happened to others, and people cried out desperately for help. Hugo cursed loudly and assumed an attack stance, the bow reappearing in his hand and the fire once again engulfing his body. But then a loud roar was heard, which made the man turn around. As it turned out, the very first dragon that had flown in from the auction hall was flying at him from behind. And now the dragon's jaws were ready to close on the man's neck. But then someone flew into the monster from the side, pushing it away. As it turned out, it was Harry, who kicked the monster again, causing it to fly down, and shouted for the man to stop clicking his beak. Landing on the ground, Hugo told the man that he owed him a favor, to which the man asked him if he wasn't a combat-type constellation. Annoyed, Harry shouted that why the hell was he weaker than him, a craftsman, and it was even scary to leave him unattended. Hugo sat sadly on the ground, bringing his knees to his chest, when the man shouted at him to finally pull himself together. Hugo jumped to his feet and shouted in irritation that he was doing everything he could, to which Harry asked him why he had almost lost his lunch. And then the men continued their squabble. But then they heard someone's loud cry, which made them pause and turn around. As it turned out, it was Stephen, who also reached the already destroyed tower and irritably called out to the men. Lightning flew around him as he screamed, asking them why the hell they dared to stop him from testing his new weapon. Meanwhile, the red dragon made of flesh and bone screamed again, opening its mouth wide. Looking at the monster, Harry replied that he had already forgotten that there were monsters here. But before he could do anything, lightning began to flash around him and Hugo. It was Stephen who flew forward and shouted that no one was allowed to ruin his reunion with the bone of the demonic beast. Harry, frowning, only asked why the man had his underwear on inside out, to which Hugo asked him what he was talking about. Stephen's lightning flickered even brighter as he furiously rushed forward to attack the monsters. The man swung his relic and used a sovereign skill, causing a glowing dome to appear on the ground, shielding the people and the red dragon from the blue dragon. As he landed, Stephen laughed quietly and told everyone not to move. The man stood right in front of the brightly glowing dome, placing the bone on the ground, and said that they were not allowed to do anything inside the permissive thunderstorm. He grinned and squeezed the bone tighter in his hand, saying that all preparations were now complete. Aiming at the blue dragon, he said that he was previously at a disadvantage, causing him to counterattack with magical energy. Throwing the bone over his shoulder, Stephen said that now he wanted to test the true power of this little one. The people who were nearby greeted Stephen with delight. Someone even shouted that he was the most powerful saint who surpassed even Harry. The blue dragon looked around in shock as the screams of Stephen's fans could be heard. And Stephen, coming closer, told the monster that it was time for him to pay for all the mess he had caused. The man suddenly pulled his hands back with the bone in his hand to strike at the monster. The man jumped up and hit the dragon on the head, but nothing happened. Noticing that nothing had happened, all the participants and the observer froze with frantic expressions on their faces. Stephen landed awkwardly back on the ground in front of the dragon. The man turned the bone over, examining it, and the dragon also turned its head thoughtfully. They began to examine this supposedly most powerful relic without understanding anything. A few seconds later, Stephen screamed loudly again, and a pair of lightning bolts flew out of his eyes. And he began to strike the dragon with many blows, but it was all indifferent. These small blows began to irritate the monster, and soon he swung his paw with a loud roar, hitting Stephen in the face, causing him to fly off to the side. As he fell to the ground, Stephen wondered what was wrong, because these were direct hits. So why wasn't Harry's weapon working? Hugo asked Harry if they could get out of here, to which he, touching the barter, replied that he couldn't, because it was still a sovereign skill. Even he would need a lot of time to dispel it. Harry, annoyed, clenched his fists and swore that Stephen, as soon as he got out of here, would regret being born. Hugo, being equally annoyed, asked what kind of idiot would throw away sovereign skills so stupidly. The men were distracted from this problem, remembering that they needed to deal with something else first. As it turned out, there were people standing in front of the dragon made of bones and flesh, but they were like zombies, and Harry asked if they were really monsters, parts of that alluring thing. Hugo replied that these were people who had fallen under the influence of the monster. Judging by the placement of the victims, the monster seemed to be planning to use them as human shields. This means that they won't be able to attack the dragon so easily. Immediately, the sounds of many feet stamping could be heard. Harry said with a smile on his face that it looked like they only had one choice, and Hugo asked what it was. Harry, yawning, walked forward and said that he was just going to kick the monster's ass, to which Hugo immediately rushed after the man, and as it turned out, the man was about to be attacked by a man subordinated to the monster from the side. But Harry immediately reacted and grabbed the man by the head. His eyes turned black and his pupils glowed brightly as he squeezed his head. Harry grabbed the dark flesh that was clinging to the man, and then he jerked his hands sharply, tearing the monster's flesh from the man. Hugo opened his mouth wide and stood there dumbfounded at the sight. And the dragon, who was walking forward surrounded by his new subordinates, turned around in surprise. The man fell unconscious into Harry's arms, and he smiled and said that it was simple. Hugo asked the man if the man was alive. The flesh that had fallen to the ground began to move again as Harry replied that he had simply passed out, and the saint asked him how he had done it. Harry chuckled and replied that he did it with his power, and Hugo then pointed out that he couldn't do that. Covering his grin with his hand, Harry turned to his friend and said that he hadn't had much hope for him from the start. Hugo noted irritably that he could have cheered him up a little. And then, smiling humbly, Hugo told the man to forget. The men's bodies began to glow brightly, and Hugo said that since Harry was going to go forward, he would cover him, to which the other noted that there was still some of the old heat left in the man, and they confidently moved forward to begin their first joint work after such a long time. Hugo stopped and began to draw his bow, and Harry went on and said that they should not delay, but rather deal with everything in one go. Meanwhile, the dragon of flesh and bone with his numerous army also began to approach the men. Harry took a quick step forward, pushing off the ground. With a quick jump, he rose into the air, and his palms, which were glowing, left a bright trace in the air. The next moment, the man landed right in the center of the crowd, and along the way, he tore off parts of the monster's flesh, freeing them from control. Noticing this, the dragon growled threateningly, and then he opened his mouth wide in a loud roar, and pieces of flesh were torn from his body and rushed forward. Harry, who was running closer to the dragon, pushed away these parts of flesh with his hands and exclaimed that he was trying in vain. Harry ran forward as he noticed that the pieces of flesh were now flying past him. Turning around, he realized that the monster was now aiming not at him, but at the crowd of townspeople behind him. Pieces of flesh were moving towards the crowd, which was still in a state of shock from the previous control. But before these tentacles could reach the people, something in the crowd began to shine with a bright light. And then there was an explosion that burned away these parts of the flesh. As it turned out, the explosion was the work of Hugo, who was standing behind the crowd. The man's eyes blazed with a bright fire as he said menacingly that such a thing would not happen on his watch. Looking at Hugo, Harry shouted that he was doing well, and in the meantime, he was getting closer and closer to the dragon. The dragon rushed forward towards the man, but he suddenly slowed down and shouted that it was time for the skull to surrender. Feeling something, the dragon turned around in fear. Meanwhile, Harry raised his hand back to strike. His feet began to mercilessly break the ground, and his eyes lit up brightly. And then there was a deafening blow, from which the dragon's carcass flew upward, and its spine broke. The ground under Harry's feet continued to crumble. Feeling unbearable pain, the monster let out a deafening scream. And then the dragon's body was blown into tiny pieces by another explosion. Hugo, who ran up to Harry happily, said that, as expected, he dealt with him quickly. Harry, with a crater forming under his feet, said that the people who had been hurt by the monster should be coming to their senses soon, and the other turned to the crowd lying on the ground. Suddenly, Harry noticed that his hand was glowing green. Raising his palm, he noticed that the Ophiuchus sign on his hand was glowing, and the man wondered what it meant. And the next moment, a multitude of messages rose from his palm into the air. The report stated that he had defeated a powerful monster with his bare hands, and as a result, his divinity had increased to 81%, and the question arose as to whether he wished to use the divine energy to use the first-level skill, Battle Instinct. Harry sighed and thought that now was the time to try it out, and so he smiled and said that he wanted to use it. Meanwhile, Stephen continued to fight the other dragon with the relic, looking quite battered. He thought that he could never have imagined that things would turn out like this. He wondered why the artifact wasn't working, and whether he was incapable of revealing its true power. Is he still too weak? While the dragon was still full of strength, Stephen suddenly made a strangled sound. The people watching the Saints fight noticed that the man was losing, but then someone pointed out something. As it turned out, it was Harry, who was tearing apart Stephen's sovereign skill barrier with his bare hands. Raising his head, Stephen was surprised to find that someone had managed to destroy his sovereign skill. The dragon also felt the waves of power coming from Harry, and he said that this was a danger that needed to be destroyed first. And then the dragon opened his mouth wide in a loud cry, and he cried out that he must kill him. And then he rushed at Harry, who was already standing in front of the dragon, to grab him with his teeth. But then Harry looked up and sternly told the dragon to shut up, and the light around his body became even brighter. And the next moment, some invisible force pressed the dragon's head to the ground. Strong streams of energy erupted from Harry, and people nearby screamed in fear. Stephen, who was closest, was completely swept away by these streams. An invisible force pressed the dragon's entire body to the ground, causing it to make a muffled sound. When Harry approached the monster, he asked how a mere man could have such power. He asked him if he was not a man at all. In response to this, Harry simply raised his leg and asked the dragon what he was talking about. And then he kicked the monster with a sharp movement, causing it to fly back. Stephen had been watching this all this time, and he thought that he couldn't believe his eyes. Gritting his teeth, he thought that there was only one person who possessed such power, and that person could only be Harry. And Harry, meanwhile, moved closer to Stephen. Looking down at him, the man said he was very glad to meet again, and it looked like he had had a great time while he was gone. Stephen's body shook slightly. He stood up and said incredulously that he didn't believe it. And then he screamed angrily that he couldn't be him. And then he delivered a quick blow with the bone to Harry's shoulder. But then Stephen's eyes widened in surprise. As it turned out, his blow did not hit Harry's body, because he managed to grab the artifact with his hand, and his body glowed with a bright light. Harry asked if the lion cub really liked his toy so much, and in response, Stephen growled in irritation. And the next moment, Harry clenched his fist, causing the great artifact to crumble into small pieces. The man smiled and apologized, saying that it was an accident and that the piece of bone was too fragile. Meanwhile, Stephen's face was frozen in an expression of complete horror and shock. Harry said it was a shame he had spent so much time and effort, and it was all for nothing. And then he asked if it was his turn now, and he raised his hand to strike. Stephen weakly asked the man to stop, but he did not listen, and with his blow he slammed the man's body into the ground. The impact was so strong that it sent dust flying several meters into the air, and was able to pierce the island through and through. Stephen's cheek immediately swelled as he flew through the air, and with a loud cry the man flew down from the island. The scream was so loud that it could be heard even in the castle where Sophie, who was unconscious, was still located. After some time, the woman woke up, lying on the floor, and she asked what she was doing there. Her head was splitting mercilessly, and something was dimly flickering on her neck. Hugo walked slowly towards Harry, and the hole in the ground he had made. Laughing, Harry exclaimed that they would see each other again. Hugo asked the man if he had really sent him straight down, to which he replied that it didn't matter, because the lion cub had plenty of vitality. Harry asked Hugo if he had dealt with the people inside the barrier, to which he was told he was being shown the crowd, which was cheering loudly. Then Harry summoned the pig bank, and it appeared right next to the man. The man ordered him to look around carefully and collect all useful items, and the beast began to vacuum everything he saw. Harry said that he almost forgot that he came here with his friend. Then Hugo asked who it was. Harry replied that his friend's name was Scott, and Hugo, hearing his son's name, froze in shock. Hugo's body shook and he asked again, to which Harry repeated Scott's name again. And then he said that he was a Templar of the Twins, but given his level, he would be quite suitable for a bishop. And he said that he died, despite his young age, and therefore he would be useful. Hugo grabbed his head, thinking about when his son had managed to get involved with this headache. Harry looked at his friend suspiciously as he thought about how the last thing he wanted was for them to meet, since both of his children were fans of Harry. And if they find out that he is alive, then his family will be doomed. After a short silence, Harry said that the guy was with a bishop who could teleport and he could call them here, to which Hugo shouted that they'd better just get out of here. Harry asked why this was, to which Hugo replied that the twins despised him, so what was the point in getting involved with them? Hearing this, Harry immediately remembered what Scott had done before, and he thought about how he often irritated him, and Hugo, still clinging to this, continued to convince him that the boy hated him. Harry, annoyed, said that despite all the care they had shown him, he should have been prepared for this, and Hugo patted him nervously on the shoulder and said that there was no point in worrying so much about some kids. But then Scott's voice was heard calling his father, And the man froze. Still holding his hand on Harry's shoulder, he turned back with a disbelieving face. Scott, holding the phone to his cheek, ran closer. And he asked if they were talking about Harry. Hugo froze in fear, his mouth wide open, and he wondered what the hell his son was doing here. Had the bell really been active all this time? Scott let out an irritated cry for his father to answer, and he began babbling uncertainly as the monster's flesh began to creep up on Harry from behind. This flesh, having come close enough, rose into the air. Hugo immediately jumped to the side. The flesh rushed towards the man as he stood there impassively. But then something appeared right in front of Harry's face. As it turned out, it was a clot of lime mucus that had swallowed all that flesh. Lime closed his mouth and the last piece of flesh disappeared into it. There was a message that the slime ball that can recreate anything has received poison resistance, and poison resistance is now a base effect when creating new relics. Harry shook Lime angrily, shouting at him that he shouldn't put anything in his mouth, and he ordered him to spit the stuff out. While Harry was still trying to pull the flesh out of the lump of slime, Hugo turned back, and he thought about how it had fallen from the remains of that bony monster, and it was quite dangerous. Scott noticed that the slime was just like one of Harry's relics that he had read about. The guy walked forward in disbelief, saying that the man had amazing skills and an inexhaustible supply of energy. A joyful Scott cried out that the 13th Awakened's only friend was his father, and so he asked the man if he was really Harry. Hugo only sighed in concern in response, not knowing what to do. Scott, however, was in a joyful and delighted state. Harry, however, was distracted from the lump of slime and turned around in irritation. Meanwhile, a meeting was taking place at the headquarters of the Lion Branch. The meeting took place in a conference room with many people sitting around the table. Oliver said that the chief hadn't been in touch since yesterday, and since the twins were good at searching, they needed to hire them. A man asked him if they would agree to help them after that altercation, to which Oliver quietly cursed and said that he was just trying to look cool. The same man said that there were rumors that the head had not yet shown up because of Harry. Oliver raised his head and said that it was all nonsense, and even if his return was true, he still lost to their boss in the past. But then a melody began to play in the hall. Someone's voice sang that he despised Leos and hated Sagittarius. Everyone turned awkwardly to look at the source of the sound, as the voice sang that it only wanted Harry. Everyone stared at the girl sitting opposite Oliver. The girl picked up the phone and apologized, and then she leaned back in her chair and said that she forgot to turn it off. It was Chelsea, the vice chief, the cardinal of the Lion's Branch. Oliver wearily grabbed his head when the man indignantly called out to the girl. Oliver exclaimed that their leader was missing, so they needed to take the matter more seriously. Chelsea just asked why the hell they were looking for him at all. But then she corrected herself, asking again in more correct words, and then she said that their leader was tenacious, so he was definitely fine, and everyone thought that maybe she was right. Oliver exclaimed that, as vice chief, she should be leading the search and not pretending it didn't concern her, and in the meantime she received messages. But Chelsea didn't pay attention to the man, reading the messages that they had a new uncle, so she needed to get home as soon as possible. The girl stood up from the table and turned around, saying that she would be leaving early, so let them sort everything out here. And then she left the room in complete silence. Oliver grabbed his head. He began to make irritated cries. His eyes began to squint. Meanwhile, a crowd of journalists gathered outside Sophie's residence, asking whether the drachma incident was connected to Harry, who dared to kidnap her, and what this 20-year-old truth was. Sophie's subordinates went outside and said that there was no comment today. The Holy Lord also needed rest. They said that she would answer all the questions later on the official broadcast, and now they should go their separate ways. Meanwhile, Sophie stood by the window, wrapped in a blanket with a mask on her face. She pulled the curtains closed in irritation and cursed at Harry. The woman bit her nail in irritation, something still glowing dimly on her neck. And she thought about how this Harry dared to make a big deal out of that incident. Yesterday, after the incident at Drachma, subordinates tried to take Sophie away from the journalists. But suddenly something on her neck glowed with a bright light. People cried out in fear, asking what it was, whether it was a terrorist attack. But it turned out that it was some kind of message. And in the sky there appeared a message from Harry, asking what Harry had killed. And from below, there was an exclamation that it was the truth from 20 years ago. Sophie clutched her head, thinking that if she told the truth, the rest of the saints would not leave her alone. But if she did nothing, Harry would create even more problems for her. The woman, standing on the bed, raised her head and screamed desperately. Meanwhile, Harry, scratching his ear, asked if he should make ramen. The news anchor said that Sophie is currently not leaving her residence. There have been no comments yet. He said that of all the incidents that occurred at the auction, This one was expected to cause the most commotion. A man sat and watched the news. After hearing what the presenter said, the man said that this would not work. The next day, Harry was still at Hugo's house. Hugo and Harry were practicing shooting, and one of them hit the bullseye with an arrow. After this, the man lowered the bow, which was decorated with various monograms, and it had 4 bowstrings. The wind whistled over Hugo's head, ruffling his hair. Harry asked the man how he liked the new bow, to which he replied that he really liked it. The bow that the goat gave him wasn't even close. The next moment, Harry released an arrow, and it hit Hugo's arrow right and broke it in half. Harry happily exclaimed that he had another 10 points, and Hugo looked at the man suspiciously. And then he asked him if he had to practice shooting blindfolded, to which he replied that it was quite fun. Hugo exclaimed, asking the man if he had been shooting at his target on purpose, to which Harry pulled off his blindfold and grinned, replying that he enjoyed annoying him. Suddenly, a glass of water and ice appeared in front of Harry's face. As it turned out, it was Scott, who, with a look burning with admiration, literally on his knees brought the man water and a towel, in response to which he received gratitude. Harry happily took the glass of water, and the boy and the man smiled at each other, while Hugo was in an extremely irritated state. The man ran a little closer and asked his son if he thought his father could use a drink too. In response, Scott coldly told his father that there was water in the refrigerator and he could go and get it himself. Hugo fell to the ground and began to roll around on it, screaming pitifully, while Scott watched this, and Harry, drinking cold water, noted that his characteristics had increased since the skirmish in Drachma, so he could afford a small investment. There have been reports that the sacred abode of Ophiuchus, the Palace of the Snake, has been recreated. Due to the low level of the sacred abode, the space is very limited. The sacred chamber is a place where the constellation bearer can live, train, and test their power level. Harry could now control his chamber, and he could summon a low-level piggy bank avatar to his chamber. There was also a message that by bringing human avatars into the abode, he would strengthen the power of the abode. Walking back to their abode, Harry scratched his chin thoughtfully, wondering where he could get human avatars. Here, Scott said that since the man was leaving soon, they could go together. Since he also had things to do, Harry noticed that he didn't even realize that so much time had passed. Hugo, who had stopped lying on the ground, asked the man if he had an appointment, to which he received an affirmative answer. With a wave of his hand, Harry threw the towel over his shoulder and said with a grin that he would have to meet a lot of people today. After some time, he reached a cafe that sold fried chicken. Simon, who was sitting at the table with a huge plate of chicken on it, asked Harry if he would like to join the twins. While chewing on the chicken, Harry asked the man if he hadn't said he was overwhelmed with worries, but here he had more than enough energy, and the waitress who brought more chicken was surprised that the man was going to eat it all. Simon replied that, although he had his hands full, hiring promising people always remained a priority. Simon asked the man with a sly face if he was going to just leave them after he bought items worth millions of dollars with the twins' branching money. Hearing this, Harry just stared at the man, continuing to chew, and then he brought a napkin to his mouth to wipe himself, and Simon realized that Harry had apparently planned this. Harry thought that the man had seemed pushy at first, but things were turning out quite well. He thought that he had already dealt with Victor, Sophie, and Stephen, and the next person he needs to deal with is that bitchy purple witch. Taking another leg in his hands, Harry said that he would enter into the branching of the twins, to which Simon quickly said that then they should discuss an official date. But he was interrupted by the first and said that he had one condition. Harry pointed the chicken leg he was holding at Simon and told him to give him the badge he was wearing. Simon's subordinates immediately became alarmed and cried out that the Holy Lady had personally handed the emblem to their bishop, to which Harry only responded by saying that they should not interfere in the conversations of adults. Simon asked the man if he wanted to get the emblem to enjoy the privileges of their branch, to which Harry replied that they could shower him with promises, but it was hard for him to believe in anything until he got his hands on it. Smiling, he asked the bishop if he would be willing to make a small investment. After a moment's hesitation, Simon responded tensely, saying that he needed to think about it. The subordinates, hearing this, immediately became alarmed again and called the bishop, but Harry told him to decide faster. Picking up his phone, where he had texted Scott that his matter would take some time, he told the bishop that he had one more matter to attend to today. Scott, who was sitting in another cafe, told the man to take his time, and his sister said she would also be late. Scott thought that this place was famous for its excellent ice cream, so his uncle must appreciate it. In his delight, the boy thought that he couldn't believe he was calling Harry his uncle. This would definitely amaze his sister, and he couldn't wait to see her amazed face. Humming happily, the boy took out his knife and thought about asking his uncle to sign the dagger he had fixed for him. But suddenly someone, saying that it was dangerous to play with knives, snatched the dagger from the guy's hands. Some guy smirked and said that Scott might get hurt, so he would confiscate the knife. Scott immediately jumped up from the table and cried out, asking what this all meant. As it turned out, the one who took the knife was Eugene, a Templar of the A-class twin branch, and behind him stood his retinue. Scott cried out in irritation, asking what he was doing there, and then told him to give him back the knife, to which Eugene replied that this was not how he should greet his elder. Scott gritted his teeth and thought about how this guy was always bothering him because he was slightly older, and he would love to beat the crap out of him, but he couldn't. But Scott can't conflict with him because this bastard is the son of the holy sign of Libra, and that's the only reason he so boldly turns his nose up. But still, the enraged Scott cried out that he didn't even know what kind of dagger it was, and he had to return it immediately. But the next moment, two guys from Eugene's retinue pressed the guy's face into the table. Eugene told Scott that public places needed to be quiet, to which Scott yelled at him to shut up. Other patrons had already taken notice of the altercation. Scott, pinned to the table, looked up and asked the guy if he really thought he could get away with it, to which the guy replied that those were too big words for someone with their face pinned to the table. The guy asked another why he treasured this little thing so much, and whether it was really made by his beloved Harry. And then he asked if this knife really belonged to his incapacitated mother. Hearing this, Scott screamed loudly in anger, and blue flashes began to shine around him. But then suddenly the dagger began to shine with a bright light. Messages appeared that the owner of the relic was in danger, and a random skill was activated. Eugene cried out, covering his eyes with his hand, asking what it was. And then he saw someone's head emerge from the dagger. The head hit Eugene in the nose and jaw with great speed, causing the boy to bleed. Everyone present looked at this with an expression of shock on their faces. Meanwhile, Harry continued to crawl out of the dagger, straight towards the guy. When Harry was completely out, Eugene dropped the dagger from his hands and fell to the floor, pressing his hands to his jaw and screaming in pain. Scott looked at his uncle with joy, tears appearing in the corners of his eyes. The man looked around in confusion and scratched the top of his head while Eugene was still screaming in pain. Scott asked his uncle how he knew he would be there, to which the man replied that he had been at the restaurant a minute ago, and it seemed like the one-time summoning skill he had imbued into the dagger had just worked. Harry put his hands in his pockets and looked around. And then he noticed the bastards who were bullying the guy. An irritated Harry turned to the boys and asked them how they dared to offend his nephew, to which they immediately became afraid. Smiling evilly, the man cracked his fists and said that now they would find out what happens to those who bother his loved ones. A shudder immediately ran through the boys' bodies. A few minutes before Harry was called, Simon said that he would give the man the emblem if he joined them immediately, and he agreed. The man thought that this was a ridiculous price for such a loot, and besides, he could get the emblem back by adding a clause to the entry contract. And then the man took off his badge and handed it to Harry, telling him to use it wisely. And then he immediately took the contract from his subordinate. But when the man turned around, he saw only a bright flash in front of him, and then Harry disappeared, as if he had never been there. Simon and his subordinate froze in shock, wondering if he had just disappeared. The next moment, a waitress came up to them and handed them a check for several $100s, and Simon asked, confused, how much the bill was. After some time, the sounds of blows began to be heard in the cafe where Harry was. The guys who had been pestering Scott were now unconscious, lying on the floor surrounded by shards of a flower pot. Eugene challenged the man if he knew who he was, but before he could finish speaking, Harry punched the guy in the face. The guy tried to say that he was an A rank in the twin branching, but he didn't get to finish either because the man kneed him in the stomach. But Eugene did not calm down, and he tried to say that he was the son of the holy sign of Libra, but his phrase was cut off by another blow. Harry continued to hit the guy, which made him unable to finish speaking. Eugene backed away so that his back rested against the table. His face was swollen from the many blows as he desperately prayed in his mind for the man to at least let him finish. But the blows continued, and the boy fell to the floor exhausted, thinking that his magical defense was of no use, and Harry told him to get up, because they were not finished yet. Eugene cursed under his breath, clenching his shaking hand into a fist. His body became engulfed in blue fire as he thought angrily that this scum should know its place. Eugene put his hands forward, summoning the Bull of Phalaris, and a blue magic circle appeared below him, with a huge white bull standing behind him. The other visitors, noticing that the guy was using magic in the public area, hurried to run away as far as possible. Eugene laughed, and it became clear that he was now missing a tooth, and he said that the man would be punished for his arrogance. But suddenly, the guy's powers flowed towards Harry, and he noticed that the guy was too noisy. These streams of power gathered into a glowing ball in the man's hand, and he said that he became interested in what kind of miracle skill this was. But now he realized that he couldn't even light the corners with it. There were reports that Harry had suppressed the enemy's magic. Information was collected. Eugene cried out in confusion, asking the man if he was also a magician. Harry replied that he was a craftsman. There were messages that he could now fully use the skill. Information about the skill would be lost after using it. A green crystal appeared in Harry's hand, and he said that now he would show him how to use this power correctly. And then Harry used this skill, and everything around was illuminated with a bright light. Eugene screamed as he was carried backwards by the currents of force. And then a stream of light pierced the wall of the cafe and hit the wall of another building. The flow created a depression in the ground, and Eugene stopped at the wall of another building with his butt up. The boy's underpants were now visible to everyone, and Harry said that if he dared bother Scott again, he would fry him to a crisp. Smiling, the man said that if those idiots came again, he could safely contact him. His uncle would always cover his back. Then a girl came into the cafe and called Scott by name. It turned out it was Chelsea, who looked around and asked what the hell had happened. Scott, approaching her, waved his hands joyfully and exclaimed that this was not the main thing now. Pulling her forward by her clothes, the guy pointed his hand at Harry. The guy exclaimed that this was the same man who had defeated countless monsters and saved their world more than once. The very same hero from the videos that they love to watch again and again. Chelsea stared at Harry in shock, even pinching her cheek to make sure she wasn't dreaming. The girl's face turned slightly red as she said she couldn't believe it, and she noticed that Harry looked much more attractive than before. She said that 20 years ago his entire body was covered in scars, and since he had spent 20 years in the tower, she was sure that his appearance would be even more pitiful. Pressing her hand to her chest, she said that his appearance was not the most important thing. She said she was genuinely glad he was safe and sound. Scott told his sister that she had blurted out all her thoughts, and the girl's face flushed even brighter. Harry waved to the girl and said that he was glad to meet her, in response to which Chelsea introduced herself and bowed deeply to him, thanking him for helping her brother. Harry smiled happily, saying that they should skip the formalities, since she was Hugo's daughter, and therefore his niece. Tears appeared in the girl's eyes, and Scott mockingly noted that she was so happy. Chelsea blushed again and nervously twirled a strand of hair around her finger, as she said she didn't want to burden him right after their first meeting. But could he do her a favor? Meanwhile, the floor behind the girl began to become covered with cracks that were approaching her, and suddenly a huge monster, similar to a lizard, appeared behind her. And the monster's scream mixed with the girl's words. Harry asked again about the last words, not understanding what it was supposed to mean. Meanwhile, Chelsea turned around sharply and chopped off the monster's head with a spear that appeared in her hand in a second. The tip of her spear swung sharply to the side. Scott hid behind Harry, who called out to the girl, who turned around and walked away somewhere, saying that she would be back in a minute. Red lightning flashed around her body, and she said that she would make a proper proposal after she dealt with the temptation. And then she flew out of the cafe like a bullet and ran forward. Scott noticed that it looked like his sister had been hit in the head with a fake one, while Harry was at a loss as to what he had heard. His face took on an expression of horror as he asked again about the offer. An alarm sounded in the street, announcing that something dangerous had been detected. A call was made to evacuate to a safe place when a clawed paw landed on the tower. Many dragons flew in the sky above the city, and monsters also raged on the ground. The alluring ones continued to appear in different parts of the city, making their way through the asphalt. But then one of the monsters was pierced with a few quick movements. As it turned out, it was Chelsea with her glowing spear. But when she dealt with one, 4 more monsters emerged from the ground. But this did not stop the girl, and she began to quickly chop these monsters into small pieces, mentally urging herself on. All her thoughts were filled with the fact that she had to finish as soon as possible and propose to her uncle. However, there was still no end to the monsters. Chelsea grabbed the spear and began to spin it, thinking that there was nothing left to do but destroy them all at once. The girl slowly walked forward, twirling the spear behind her back, causing a bright circle to shine behind her and lightning to fly in all directions. She took another step forward, and this step alone crushed the asphalt under her feet. She raised her hand up, throwing her spear into the air, which began to glow brightly. And then she looked up at the monsters, her eyes glowing with an angry red light, and she told them not to dare interfere with her love. And then she swung her hand sharply, sending the spear flying. And the tip of the spear immediately headed towards the crowd of monsters that were running straight towards Chelsea. And the girl used the lotus flash technique, and everything around was illuminated with bright light. Harry had already left the cafe and watched as the girl dealt with the monsters. He thought with a smile that he had followed her because he was worried about her safety, but it seemed there was no need for that. And one could even say that her fighting instincts were even sharper than Hugo's. Chelsea turned her head and noticed a man standing behind her. She raised her hand when suddenly another monster appeared from the ground behind her. The monster snapped its jaws shut with a loud bang, but Harry managed to save Scott and his older sister, grabbing them and running away. The girl's face turned a little red again as she called out to her uncle. The man's cap was burning in the fire when the monster said that it seemed like there were interesting creatures in this world. The monster woman pulled her whip and said with a smile that she liked it, so she would make a special pet out of it. She sat on a throne that was on the back of a huge monster, from whose mouth lava flowed. Coming closer, Harry asked why everyone was so hot-headed today, although it didn't matter, because he needed a furnace to create new relics anyway. And he exclaimed that it was great that the monster would become his #1 gas heater. The woman smiled and remarked that this man was very funny. Chelsea, who was standing behind the man, thought that the race in front of them was an illusory race. Noticing that the girl was lost in thought, Harry poked her in the forehead, interrupting her thoughts, and asked what she was thinking about. And then he told the guys to leave everything to him, and they themselves would take care of the evacuation of the residents. Turning away, he said with a smile that he trusted them with this because he knew that they were strong, and therefore they should trust him too. In response to this, Chelsea did not say anything against it, but only smiled. And then she and her brother said in unison that they would take care of it. A glow of different colors immediately appeared around the bodies, which meant that they were ready, and Harry said that now the fun would begin. The woman, still sitting on the monster's back, began to swing her whip. However, Harry successfully dodged every blow. But this brought only joy to the opponent, and she cried out for him to continue to resist. But then the whip wrapped around the man's body, pinning his arms to his body. The woman screamed her hand up and shouted that this taming would be incredibly fun. As she jerked her hand sharply, Harry's body immediately rose into the air, and then she started waving her hand, causing Harry's body to hit the asphalt and the houses that were nearby. With another such blow, Harry's body hit the ground, but he landed on his knees and there was a crater under his feet. Rising to his feet, he easily tore the whip that bound him and asked if that was all she could do. Noticing this, the woman began to smile even wider, anticipating fun. And then a fireball burst out of her monster's mouth and flew straight at the man. There was a huge explosion and a huge mushroom cloud rose into the air. Meanwhile, Scott and Chelsea were busy evacuating residents. Supporting the fallen rock, Scott told the people to hurry to the evacuation center. The guy smiled and noted that he was already finished here. Running up to his sister, he informed her that he had helped all the remaining civilians, but Chelsea seemed to pay no attention to him at all. Her gaze was directed forward to where Harry was fighting the monster. Frowning, she thought that although Uncle was strong, his opponent was a representative of the illusory race, which was one of the most dangerous ones that brought misfortune, and she was at least a red class. She wondered what to do if his old wounds from the time of the tower made themselves known. Chelsea jumped up and ran forward. Deciding she had to help the man, Scott shouted after her that they had been told not to interfere. The monster laughed, saying that she seemed to have overdone it, and she apologized, saying that she didn't mean to burn him to the ground. And in the meantime, there was a huge crater in front of her. But then she heard an enthusiastic cry. Someone's 2 eyes flashed in the smoke, and the man said that this is exactly what fire should be like, and the fire of that boy from the twins could barely warm his palms. A ball of fire appeared in front of Harry's face as he grinned widely. He exclaimed that it would now definitely become his burner, and a message appeared that the resulting fire was suitable for use in the creation workshop. The monster did not expect this at all, and she was surprised to notice that the man had survived the hellfire. Shouting that they must not delay, Harry raised his hand with some kind of small hammer. A message appeared asking him to select an item to cast the spell on, and Harry raised his hand over the fireball where there was some kind of cube. A glowing pentagram appeared under the man's feet, and the monster frowned and said that she didn't understand anything. And then she screamed that she would not let him do this. But before the monster could do anything, Chelsea appeared behind her, already activating her skill. And then the girl used the skill Lightning Rumble, and a bright lightning fell on the monsters. However, something unexpected happened, causing the girl to open her mouth wide. As it turned out, the woman caught the girl's spear with her hand and it began to melt. And with a sharp movement of her hand, the monster threw the girl back and she flew straight into the house. Chelsea hit her back hard against the building and blood started running from her mouth. Meanwhile, the lizard-like monster moved forward to devour the man. The monster jumped up and opened its mouth to devour the girl, who was still hanging on the wall of the building. But before this happened, the monster was suddenly pulled back by something. As it turned out, it was Harry who grabbed the monster's tail and began to twist it. The man cried out, asking where the lizard was going since he was her enemy. And then he spun quickly, and the lizard flew straight off the building. The lizard hit its back with a dull thud against the wall of the building and opened its mouth wide and let out a silent scream. The female monster was shocked to see that her underworld lizard had been defeated so easily. But then Harry appeared in front of her, looking at her with an angry look, as if he was preparing to devour her. And he said that if she touched Chelsea again, he would not leave a wet spot on her. The woman felt like she was looking straight into the huge eye of a snake that could kill her at any second. She drew back and noticed that something was consuming her. She grabbed her head, not believing that someone could absorb her, a representative of the illusory race. And then the woman burst into a bright purple flame, and she said that now she realized that the games were over. Chelsea held her hands out in front of her and noted that the woman was emitting absurdly large streams of magic. The woman said she didn't like the uniform because she wouldn't be able to work out in it. But it looks like she will have to admit that the man is her enemy. The woman's body turned purple. She looked menacingly at Harry and said that she would incinerate him first and then everything in the area. And then she darted forward, and the outline of an eagle was visible around her. However, the woman's fist was met by Harry's fist. Chelsea screamed for her uncle. And then, in that very place, a bright flash shone. And then everything around was engulfed in a bright purple light. Sensing something was wrong, the female monster looked forward and was surprised. As it turned out, Harry held back her blow with the help of a transparent glove, which was a Class C artifact. The woman's eyes widened and she asked in disbelief if her attack had really been stopped by a plastic glove. While Harry's body was using super regeneration, he smirked and said that now she should get it for daring to burn this city. The bright light came on again as the woman exclaimed that it was humiliating. Harry asked her if she was belittling the abilities of his glove. He opened his eyes, which were glowing faintly, and he said with a smile that she couldn't even imagine how useful this glove was when eating fried chicken. There were reports that the Hellwings had too much negative energy to be made into an avatar, and that it needed to be cleansed. And then Harry asked in irritation if the cleansing fist would work, and he began to deliver a series of cleansing blows to the hellish wings. The woman fell to the ground, her body returned to its original form, and the man asked her if she was still not purified. A message appeared that dead targets could not be cleansed. Harry asked if she couldn't handle that either. Turning to the lizard, Harry said that he had no choice but to replace the gas burner with a lizard. The lizard immediately surrendered to the man, and reports emerged that the lizard of the underworld had become a captive of the snake bearer. Harry asked her what he should name the lizard and offered her several options, and she chose Torch. Scott and Chelsea immediately ran to the man, and the girl asked him if he was okay, to which Harry asked them if they were hurt. The girl replied that everything was fine, and then she said that she never had time to ask the question. And then Harry remembered the girl's words and proposal. After clearing his throat, Harry started to say something to the girl, but then she interrupted him. And then she asked if it was true that he did not sacrifice himself in the demonic tower, and this question surprised the man. Looking away and frowning, Chelsea said that she had been wondering about this for a long time. She said that the other saints claimed that he sacrificed himself for the sake of all mankind, but the fact that only one of the 13 saints died in the battle with the red-eyed one that practically destroyed the human race seemed ridiculous. But since it was impossible to obtain evidence, she only harbored her suspicions. But now, having seen with her own eyes how he fights, she is sure that he did not sacrifice himself, but became a victim of an insidious plan. Harry didn't respond to this, his face taking on a serious expression. But then he sighed and said with a smile that she was smart, as expected from Hugo's daughter. And then he told the guys that everything was correct. He told them that 20 years ago he was stabbed in the back in a demonic tower. And this was done by one of the 12 saints who went with him on the raid. Chelsea and Scott immediately had questions, and the guy asked if the saints were trying to save the world. He cried out, asking how they could do this to the greatest hero, the hope of all mankind. But then Harry said that this was exactly the point, and the guy asked again. The man replied that they did so because he was better than them, and because he was able to defeat the red-eyed one single-handedly. Since the strongest attractor was killed, the whole world could be in their power. But the only obstacle to this was he, Harry. The man sighed and said that it was impossible to know for sure, but it was only the most likely theory. After a while, Scott said in a strangled voice that it was terrible. He said that it turned out that he was locked in a demonic tower all alone, and what's more, the saints took credit for his merits. Tears streamed down Chelsea and Scott's faces, and the guy said that all of this happened despite the fact that he was the true savior of their world. Looking at the boys, Harry just sighed. Putting his hands on their shoulders, he thanked them and said that there was no need to cry. The boys looked at him with hope in their eyes, and Harry said he was going to repay the Saints in $1 million. And then he took out his phone to look at something, and he looked at the information about Sophie's press conference. The press conference took place in a huge building with 2 glass towers. The whole room was filled with people waiting to hear what Sophie would say. Sounds and camera flashes were heard throughout the hall. One woman asked the man sitting next to her what had made Sophie travel all the way to Korea for one conference, to which the man replied that he believed it had to do with the mystical message on the drachma. He said that it might seem like a rumor about Harry's recent return, but either way they would hear something incredible. Illuminated by camera flashes, Sophie sat in the middle of the room. A tense smile was frozen on her face as she thought she was in deep shit, and she wondered if she should tell everyone to go and run away. But then she remembered that she still had the relic around her neck, and who knows what kind of magic had been cast on it. And if she wants to live, then she must fulfill the demands alone. She thought about how she didn't know what the situation was with the other saints, but Harry clearly hadn't been bluffing when he said he'd get rid of her. The woman let out a long sigh, calming herself, and then she told everyone present that the reason she was here today was to reveal the truth about the incident 20 years ago, and she asked if everyone remembered the events related to the Demon Tower. The woman asked the man if she was talking about the raid on the Red-Eyed Man, to which the man replied that he was defeated by the 12 saints, and that is why they are extolled as heroes. Looking away, Sophie wanted to say that the true hero who defeated the Red-Eyed Man was Harry, but she couldn't say it. She closed her eyes tightly, forcing herself to collect her thoughts. And then she finally said it, but for some reason the crowd was not surprised. But suddenly, surprise overtook them, and they raised their wide-open eyes. Many people jumped up from their seats and asked for it to be repeated. Immediately, various questions and requests for more details began pouring in. The camera flashes became even brighter. People asked the woman if this meant that Harry was still alive, if it was all a lie of the saints. Frowning, Sophie said nothing, but only looked somewhere down. She had already said that all this was true, but suddenly a man appeared behind her and said that this was of course impossible. Hearing a familiar voice, Sophie jumped out of her chair and turned around screaming. Behind her stood Jean, the holy sign of Cancer. Jean noticed that the saint had turned completely pale and seemed unable to continue speaking. And then he looked at the woman and asked her if this was true. Sophie asked the man in a shaking voice why he was there, in response to which the man came closer and turned off her microphone. And then he leaned towards her ear. And then he told her to shut up and asked what she just said. Has she really forgotten her role, and all she had to do was show off her pretty face? What kind of show did she put on here? He leaned even closer and told her to be quiet if she didn't want the whole world to hear him rip her mouth open. And then he pressed the button again, turning on the microphone. Addressing reporters, he apologized and said that these words were only a threat from the one who kidnapped Sophie. He asked them not to worry, as he personally guaranteed the safety of the saint. He apologized to the press and said that they were forced to end the conference. One of the reporters asked about Harry's return. But then a black fog appeared in front of the man. Leaning towards him, Jean said that Harry died 20 years ago in the tower. Did they really need anything else? If the rumors were true, he would have already let us know, but for some reason he doesn't show up. The man asked who had threatened the saint then. Another one picked up the conversation, asking why the criminal had mentioned Harry. Others also did not give it up, asking if they were hiding something from them, since they wanted to end the conference already. This barrage of questions angered Jean, and black energy began to swirl around him. He thought that these miserable insects did not know their place. But before he could do anything, someone asked Jean if he was really going to kill everyone here. As it turned out, it was Harry who was flying feet first towards the man. Jean didn't have time to fully dodge, and the kick landed on his chest. The man bounced back from the blow and flew into the wall. Sophie clutched her head and screamed in fear. Jean, sitting on the floor, raised his gaze to look at the attacker. Meanwhile, Harry jumped up, getting ready to hit the man, saying that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Then the man struck again with something that looked like a tail. Sophie was surprised to discover that it was someone's tail. Meanwhile, Torch was sitting somewhere, sadly mourning his tail. Chelsea and Scott were guarding Torch, who was sitting outside surrounded by people. Taking hold of his tail again, Harry asked Jean if he really wanted to interrupt the conference like this. But then a voice was heard behind him, saying that in his hands was the tail of a lizard of an illusory race. As it turned out, Jean was behind Harry, and he said that he heard that someone had dealt with them. Harry frowned and said that the bastard was up to his clone tricks again. Jean noticed that the man quickly recognized his division skill, so he asked him who he was. Harry introduced himself with a smile as he threw his tail over his shoulder. Hearing this, the crowd of journalists immediately stared at the men. There was complete silence in the hall. But the next moment, one of the journalists laughed, and the others laughed after him, not believing that it was Harry in front of them. Jean also laughed quietly, covering his mouth with his hand. And he said that he had good skills, but he should have chosen a more suitable role model. But in response to this, Harry hit the man in the face with his tail again. Jean fell on his back from the blow, while Harry twirled his tail with one hand. The crowd was shocked when Harry said that they don't start thinking until you hit them. Turning to the crowd, he continued to wag his tail and asked the crowd what they were staring at. And then he jumped off the stage into the crowd, shouting that they were next. People started to scatter around the hall. Sophie thought in a panic that she needed to run while she still had a chance. But suddenly, something landed in front of her. Harry, who was standing behind her, asked the woman where she was going, since she still had to reveal the whole truth. Shouting, Harry began to tell the whole truth himself, and then he poked the woman in the forehead, repeating once again that she should tell everything. But then a black fog began to flow in the air around them. A report has emerged that a burst of energy from the darkest star has been detected. Shadows slowly began to creep across the hall. The lamps began to break with a loud crack, and their fragments rained down on the crowd, who began to cover their heads with screams. Sophie looked up in panic and called out questioningly if Jean was really going to do it, and Harry, not understanding what exactly Jean wanted to do, asked Sophie what she was talking about. An irritated Sophie cried out that she was not talking about him, but about this devilry, and she exclaimed that the energy of the constellation was emanating from Jean. And in the meantime, some dark figure appeared above the man, red eyes that were on her shoulders. Smiling, Jean told Harry that he would never have thought it was really him. But then he said that, however, it didn't matter why and how he was able to get out of the demonic tower alive. And then he asked if they should have a small welcome party to celebrate his return. Meanwhile, Hugo was calmly doing something at home. Placing the pot of food on the table, he told himself that since Chelsea, Scott, and Harry weren't here today, he could stick to simple ramen. And then he sat down on the sofa. Without taking off his apron with the bear, the man immediately grabbed the remote control to turn on the TV. Hugo started eating his ramen when the TV announced that they were reporting from the St. Sophia conference site, and right now it was chaos. The reporter waved her hand towards Jean and Harry and exclaimed that a man who pretended to be Harry had just burst in here. And on their screens they could now watch their fierce battle with the holy sign of Cancer. Harry, however, struck at the same time, but John managed to dodge, and therefore the man's blow hit the stage, causing it to shatter into small pieces. The reporter said that while she was saying all this, attacking skills were being heard and flashed all over the place, and Hugo froze with a face filled with shock, and his noodles almost fell out of his mouth and back into his bowl. Jean, meanwhile, stretched out his hand forward, and a black ball began to form on his palm. And then the man leaned towards the floor, causing his black energy to shoot forward, smashing the wooden stage, causing it to shatter into pieces. The reporters ran in panic away from this dark energy, which was trying to touch and injure them. Harry also jumped back from this attack, and he exclaimed that these pathetic attacks won't work on him. But Jean only exclaimed triumphantly that the man was caught, and then he suddenly raised his hands, controlling a tentacle of dark energy. And right after that, a black hole appeared under Harry's feet, who was still in the air, trying to catch the man. Sharp black spikes suddenly appeared from the black hole and rushed straight towards the man to pierce him. But instead of a victorious grin, a surprised expression appeared on Jean's face, which meant that the peaks had not hit the man. The black peaks came together, but Harry was not on any of them, and a glowing knife rested its tip on top of one of the peaks. As it turned out, it was Harry's dagger, which hung in a straight line above these peaks, keeping its balance, and its support was only in the tip of the knife. Noticing this, the journalists who had not yet left the building clapped their hands, raised their thumbs up in approval, and enthusiastic cries rang out. And then Harry fell down and, doing a somersault, landed on another whole part of the stage, several meters before Jean. He leaned low towards the stage, his knees almost touching it, and lightning ran around his body. And then Harry straightened up a little and ran very quickly straight towards his opponent. Jean crossed his arms in front of him and a black ball appeared on each of his palms, and he asked if the man had really only been practicing acrobatics for the last 20 years. And then his palms touched the floor again, and black sharp peaks quickly moved towards Harry. But Harry didn't care. He deftly dodged them or cut them with his knife, and he asked the man if he really had no more tricks left. And then he quickly appeared next to Jean and struck him in the chest. However, he felt something was wrong, and therefore looked in that direction with surprise. As it turned out, instead of the man's body, he cut his suit, from which black smoke was now coming out. An irritated Harry exclaimed, asking if he had really spent 20 years doing nothing but learning how to create clones. Again, Jean's voice was heard from somewhere behind Harry, who replied that he would consider it a compliment. A strong wind blew through the entire hall, and Sophie, clutching her head, screamed loudly. A black hurricane rose in the hall, questioning everything in its path. And this black fog also began to enter into the people who were not lucky enough to escape the tornado, into every hole, causing them to let out muffled screams. Harry asked the man if he, the crazy bastard, had really lost his mind and how he intended to clean up the aftermath. There were quiet footsteps, and Jean replied that he would somehow sort it out. The man's hands were coated in his dark energy, causing them to now become sharp blades. And Jean said that he simply decided that he needed to deal with him as quickly as possible while he still had the chance. Hearing this, Harry turned around with a frown, his eyes shining with an evil fire, and asked him if he was the same scumbag who stabbed him in the back that day. Clones began to appear around Jean one after another when he asked if he was really trying so hard to find the culprit. And then he said that it was not right for a hero to dwell on such petty grievances. The man said with a grin that people would rather take him for a street thug than a great saint. Holding the knife out in front of him, Harry responded by telling the man to stop yapping, as those words were too loud for the cowardly little thing hiding behind a bunch of clones. Jean replied that these were not just clones, but they were recreated from the life energy of the reporters who were there. And in the meantime, there were many reporters lying on the floor, and some dark energy was coming out of their mouths. The man said that if another thoughtlessly cuts up the clones, then this can dissipate all the life energy, and then everything will turn out very sadly for these people. Looking around, Harry said that such nasty tricks suited his face perfectly. A multitude of clones lined up in a line that surrounded the man, and Jean's voice was heard saying that these were his last words. His voice seemed to come from all sides, and then all the clones pounced on the man at once. Suddenly, the real Jean, who was hiding among the clones, looked forward and his face was distorted with surprise. As it turned out, all the clones' swords met not Harry's body but the lizard's tail. Harry, who appeared behind Jean, exclaimed that this was a new skill he had acquired in Drachma. The man quickly turned around to do something, but in the meantime a fist was flying towards him. Harry threw a punch at Jean, his fist hitting him right in the chest. Harry said that this Jean was not just a clone, but a part of the real Jean. So once he dealt with him, it would not be difficult for him to deal with the rest. In a panic, Jean turned around and asked the man how he had guessed. Harry replied that he had said that he was rotten. He recognized him by the smell, but in fact it was the skill Power of the 13th, which allows you to determine the weak point of the enemy. Harry quickly jerked his hand, tearing some red crystal out of his opponent's chest. As he fell to the ground, Jean asked the man how he managed to find the core when even the twins couldn't do it. There have been reports about the characteristics of the Cancer core, that a big gap has been created in the powers of the holy sign of Cancer. Harry can absorb the power of Cancer. The magical power of the dark star is dissipating. Noticing that everything had become calmer, Sophie opened her eyes with apprehension. The dark energy left the building as if it had never been there, but everything around was destroyed. The reporters began to come to their senses and rise to their feet. Jean lay on the ground with a black mist coming out of his wound as he asked Harry what he had been through in that tower, as it felt like the power of a god was pressing down on him. Harry chuckled and said that the man was talking a lot for someone who had just been made. Jean grinned and said that he would back off for now, but he still had an ace up his sleeve. His body began to dissolve into dark smoke and he said that it would become the worst headache for him. Jean's body completely evaporated. Harry, holding his core in his hands, said that it was not worth hoping that he would back down so easily. Suddenly, there was a vibration in the pocket of his sweater. As it turned out, Harry was calling Hugo. Harry picked up the phone, and Hugo's screams were immediately heard from the short line. He cried out that the man had attacked Jean's clone, meaning that they had pointed their weapon at him. Hearing this, Harry immediately became alarmed and asked again. Meanwhile, something was happening somewhere high in the sky behind the clouds. There was a station hanging in space. A red light appeared on top of the station and a sound was heard. After some time, something disconnected from this station, and then the rocket flew down. There was a huge flash, and the rocket accelerated even more. It was a Mormoth missile, a special weapon that was created by the Capricorn and Gemini branches after Harry's disappearance to destroy powerful lures. It was created in case humanity was unable to cope with the monster. This is a trump card that will destroy not only the attractor, but also a huge area around the point of impact. Harry said he couldn't believe they'd put something like that together, and Hugo cried out that it was set up to fire the rocket when Jean's biometric rhythm stopped. Harry remembered the corpse of Jean's clone, and he said that it looked like that clone was almost equal to the original Jean, and Hugo screamed at him to get out of there. Harry said that running away was not an option, as the missile would destroy everything in a huge radius, and Hugo asked if there was no solution. Suddenly, Harry grinned and looked at Sophie, causing her to flinch, and he said that there was still something they could do. Sophie stared at the man, not understanding anything. Meanwhile, the rocket was getting closer and closer to the ground. An alert sounded that a Mormouth missile was approaching and that it was necessary to swim in shelters, and people ran through the streets in panic, wondering what this missile was doing here.